and welcome to the Contemplation Deck. I am your host, the Stone Golem. This is the second episode, and we will be talking on obscure figures of history who saw massive amounts of change. So I'm joined with my usual co-host, Fish and Jish, and I'll be also today having another guest who's been a friend of a publication on the Stone Ship blog. This is Sunshine Moonlight. We'll be each introducing a figure that we've done a bit of research on, and then discussing what made us interested in this figure and what is our interest in approaching this figure, and what we might want to say about them and the implications they had in the decisions they made. I'll be talking a bit about the Italian war hero and poet extraordinaire Gabriele D'Annunzio, and who was a World War One fighter pilot, who then also was whilst after Italy had not gotten the territories they wanted from in the Adriatic, he staged a occupation in modern day Croatia in the city of Rijeka, which is back then by the Italians called Fiume. I'll talk a little bit about that, and then Sunshine, he'll introduce his person. Fish will introduce his, and I'll leave it to them to discuss a little bit about what they do with their work, and also what figure they chose and why. And I'll pass it on first to Sunshine since he's the guest of honor today.
Thank you. So I think for my obscure figure, one I had happened to have been researching a bit was Lothrop Stoddard, who is this eugenicist from early 20th century America, and I think, an interesting figure to look at just in terms of how much of a social transition occurred based on his reception in the U.S., because during the 1920s, his work was like wildfire in America, and by the time of his death, he was not really widely respected at that point, and for good reason, so I'll be excited to delve into the details.
And passing on to Fish.
And I'll be doing Yuan Shikai, who was a general, a prime minister, president, and an emperor in different forms of legitimacy and time periods. Pretty much started shaping China coming out of the imperial era and effectively doomed China to the so-called warlord period, which caused all sorts of issues, such as the rise of the Kuomintang and Chiang Kai-shek, the Civil War, and to some degree made it easier for the Japanese to wholesale invade. I would say he's not necessarily a bad person, but not really a good person either, just very ambitious. I guess you could say, he's an interesting look at someone who supposedly wanted to look out for China, but was also, a very opportunistic sort of person and slowly climbing up the rungs of power. And just a little bit of a different figure in that sense.
That's really good. All right. And so I guess each of us has one of these obscure interests. And what's really interesting is it is also, I've noticed that a lot of this shifting of change, a lot of it is this interwar period that we're all focusing on. So it's this 1920s, 1930s, lead up World War II, that sort of time as well. I was choosing D'Annunzio, who started the occupation of Fiume in 1919, and then, which lasted until about 1920 before the Italian Navy bombarded his occupation. What had happened actually in this situation is I'd watched a series. I discovered about this whole period because I'd listened to an album by the neofolk singer Jerome Reuter, who I saw last night in the Vanguard in Newtown. Fucking brilliant singer, but the whole idea of this whole period, then I looked more into it. I've watched a series on Mussolini's early kind of transition from a socialist to the fascist dictator he became, called M, Son of the Century, or a Mussolini Figlio di Secolo. And that's currently streaming in Australia on SBS On Demand, but you can get it anywhere. It was directed by, it's all in Italian, but it was directed by the guy who did Darkest Hour, the Churchill film. And then he teamed up with the screenwriter for the Italian mafioso classic. I think it's called Gomorrah. And Gomorrah is basically like a vignette-style film of it's set in the 2000s and later made a TV series out of different people who are interacting with the mafioso that exists, the Camorra mafioso that exists what happened in this situation is there's just things like he's great at doing these little vignettes and insights into life sort of thing, a bit like how Breaking Bad's direction's done with like for just life as it happens sort of like filming. I don't know, this Empress of the Century is a bit like watching Wolf of Wall Street, but it's like with Mussolini in it and all of his like close circle. And I found out more about Mussolini's background through this, which kind of put a lot more into perspective, and it makes that whole period look much more interesting. I chose D'Annunzio because he was a precursor to a lot of Mussolini's ambitions, because before Italy had even decided to go the path of fascism, or dictatorship, what should I say, because fascism, back in the day, when fascio was just seen as a league, it was like a union. And so the idea, the big split in Italy with socialism was between, before World War I, it was in interventionism and non-interventionism. And then the international syndicalist socialists didn't want to intervene in the war. And then the interventionist socialists, Mussolini was among them, eventually advocated for intervention in joining the Allies and to fight against Austria-Hungary and then get some territory off Austria-Hungary. And then Italian nationalism was one of these things which had just, Italy had just literally incorporated as a country like in the 1800s, and by nationalist sentiment in piecing together all these different duchies and kingdoms and papal states into the one thing and putting in one king. Like that Italian nationalism to reclaim, put territories which were key to the old Roman Empire was already a precursor, well before Mussolini had stepped onto the scene. But then Mussolini he was just a man, he felt like he needed to do it. But D'Annunzio was amongst some of these Italian nationalists like Sidney Sonnino and all these other people who are at the negotiating table at like the Treaty of London and with like Woodrow Wilson to try and get the parts of the Adriatic back, then Trieste and Trento. I've been on exchange to Trento, and there's all these really interesting bits of history. And Bolzano's this one city which is half German, half Italian, and all the signs are half German, half Italian, because there's a big Austrian minority. And some of them want to break away, but most of the time they're treated. Actually, it's quite well renowned as like a really great minority integration program because of that disputed territory that existed since World War One. But obviously they got Trento and Trieste, but they never got a Fiume. And because the Slovenes, Croats, and Serbians, advocated to Woodrow Wilson quite hard when the League of Nations was around to like not give him that. So then D'Annunzio just says, "Fuck this! I'm just gonna march in." And the Italian, guard is like, "You're not allowed in. This is gonna be illegal." They in Mussolini's Son of the Century, they recreated this interaction perfectly. He goes, he literally went up to them and goes like with his posse behind him, his little, like followers, and he's like, "See these war medals? You can shoot me right through the war medals if you wish." And then they realized, they can't do this, otherwise they'd have like an uprising. So they just let him through. And then he ends up setting up this occupation, which was very artist friendly, kind of like back in the day, with people like John Maynard Keynes and all that stuff doing the stuff they did. They're all very like gay, bisexual, lesbian sort of crowd. That that whole like poetry, theater, that sort of thing. Writers, they're all, as long as you could do whatever you wanted, basically situation. But you had to just respect the militarism and cult of personality of Gabriele D'Annunzio, and that's why some people try to call it pink proto-fascism. When I've read about it, it's quite funny. And the guy himself also had a samurai who had come from, I forget his name, but he had a samurai, literally a samurai, visit him in the occupation and prior to the occupation to assist. Japan he did come and he wanted to go back to Japan, and whilst the Japanese Empire was, still at the, building up, and he was like, he wanted to like learn a little bit about the politics of Italy and what was going on in, with these, with the occupations and everything. So he thought he could learn a lot from D'Annunzio, who was a war hero. So it was a whole shebang. Anyway, I could keep talking about it for ages, but I thought I'd just start that as a nice little background, and then I'll pass it on to Sunshine, and then Fish and Jish can lead in with a bit about the arcs of this his character that he's chosen.
Yeah. So Lothrop Stoddard was this American journalist and historian who was basically extremely racist and the kind of pioneer of the eugenics movement in the U.S. He was a board member of the American Eugenics Society, which became Planned Parenthood, actually. And Um, his ideas became just wildly popular during early 20th century America because, like, for example, Warren Harding, the President Warren Harding, quoted from his work in political speeches. His books were bestsellers. He's referenced in The Great Gatsby because of how just popular his work was, and his focus was basically on the idea that Western world was going to be just taken over by Asians was his big fear, because he was like, well, look at how large the populations of Asia are, how lacking in capacity, resource capacity these countries will be, and how the West is just open space, basically, and has much higher standards of living. So he basically predicted that if there wasn't a very restrictive immigration regime in place, that eventually the world would just become Asian. The ideas that he was writing, actually, he's consulted for the 1924 Immigration Act in the U.S. During World War II, he traveled to Nazi Germany before the U.S. entered the war, when it was just between Britain and Germany, and he was able to interview a lot of the top Nazis, and he actually wrote a work that influenced them. So the idea of the Untermensch, as it was called by the Nazis, was a translation of the concept he had come up with. After World War II, the American public basically just stopped reading him because they saw this guy's ideas are quite adjacent to Nazism, which obviously we had just fought a massive war against. The interest in both just his work in particular, as well as just that more general genre, had went to steep decline in the post-war period, and I think therefore we could see it as a true inflection point in U.S. history in terms of people's attitudes towards Asians, as well as in U.S. relations with Asia, which is what I mostly write about, which is why I decided to choose this historical figure to discuss, and I think that could just be my introduction.
Brilliant work. I'll pass it over to Fish now.
All right, yep. So my guy was Yuan Shikai. Yuan is his family name, of course. He was born in 1859 in Xiangcheng, Henan, China. I think he was born in a fairly well-off, like at least upper middle class sort of family, who are usually on one side either join the army or join the scholarship sort of field. So when he was growing up, about the end of his teens, he decided to try and do the imperial examinations in China, which is like the equivalent of Confucian exams that got you, if you passed how brutally hard they were, you'd get like the top levels of seniority in the administration. Despite trying twice, though, he failed, but instead he went through the army route through his family, purchasing minor titles, which back then, in the Qing army, kind of corrupt and nepotistic and all, that was the best way to go up. So he was pretty much already a assistant to one of the generals in the Huai army, which was the first sort of mode of a modernized army in China at the time, at the self-strengthening movement. So this would have been just after all the rebellions that were going on in China, such as the infamous Taiping Rebellion, that he was also born in that sort of dangerous time period with. But he probably first started shining as an officer when he was posted in Korea, when there was basically some coups and mutinies going on around 1881, at a time when Korea was still influenced by China, at least as a vassal state. Yeah, he was there for a good 12 years, had quite a few actually Korean concubines, but despite, an incredibly new modernized army for the time, which was even advanced for Western standards, when the first Sino-Japanese War started in Korea, it seemed like China was going to win, but long story short, they were completely decimated, and Yuan had to basically flee Korea, but now he had a lot of influence within the ultra-modernized so-called Beiyang army, which means something like Eastern Sea is some sort of Chinese term. And so he accumulated a lot of power there because a lot of political machinations were going on, such as the second last emperor, whose reform in the first Sino-Japanese War had failed. He was placed under house arrest, and Yuan Shikai basically betrayed him and helped with his house arrest. So he had a lot of power within the conservative sort of order. But when the Boxer Rebellion occurred, the conservative order tried to ally with the Boxers to try and get rid of all the foreigners at once, which even Yuan Shikai was like, that's dumb. You're literally declaring war on every single major nation on the planet. And so he was part of I think it's called the Southern Protection Pact or something. It was basically when they refused to carry out Beijing's orders and even arrested some of the Boxers. But nevertheless, eventually the second last emperor and the dowager who was controlling him both died in 1908, and he was taken into exile instead of getting executed. Luckily for him, he did get executed. And he was basically just like a fisherman for the time being in exile, but he still had a lot of control with, his officers and all always came back to report to him. Yeah, long story short, that's when it kind of gets complicated, but he was made prime minister to try to save the dying Qing Dynasty, but he was like, in the end, I'm not going to work with them, joins the Republicans instead, and is promised to become a president, but then both supposedly to ease China more into a democracy, tries to make a constitutional monarchy instead of him as emperor. That doesn't go down so well, obviously, and he dies in office, essentially, as a disappointed man. And I'll go into the consequences of that later.
Brilliant. I found this stuff really, really, really fascinating because I guess thinking about that, I was thinking a little bit about how, tying it to my topic a bit, how King Emmanuel had made Mussolini the prime minister made a deal to, help in Mussolini's favor so that he would be able to keep the socialists at bay who were anti-monarchist, because they knew that the monarchy was going to sink because of the Russian Revolution. There was all these people like Antonio Gramsci and people like, Gabriele Matteotti, who ended up getting murdered by Mussolini's thugs, who were, the big people, the socialists in parliament were trying to keep, were trying to take down the king eventually. And the thing is that the king obviously didn't foresee the dictatorship happening, and he ended up abdicating when Mussolini proclaimed dictatorship. But he originally had put in Mussolini to keep the socialists at bay, and he even rigged the elections in Mussolini's favor, from what I understand. So there was a lot of things that it's just in one of these situations, like, you do install someone, the Qing Dynasty, installing this dude to try and save the Qing Dynasty, despite the fact the guy had his own ideas once he was put in power, is reminiscent of what I've been looking at. So it's a lot of history does rhyme, no matter where in the world. Sunshine, I found your topic really interesting, actually, because when you circled it back to the Asia topic, I thought that was actually really interesting to me, because you were talking a little about how he had these kind of quite the genetics of Asians and stuff like that, and the amount of Asians in the world and stuff like that. And this was not very characteristic of this turn of the century politics around from the 1900s to the 1920s, especially in Australia too. So when you had all these anti-Asian, anti-Irish sort of the cartoons coming out about the immigration of process to the States, there was all this anti-Asian cartonography in the lead up to our federation, which we talk about now. Part of the reason is because there are a lot of Chinese people coming to the gold rush and working and working in local workshops and stuff like that, and happy to do it for a lower wage compared to the local Aussies. And then that's how this unionism was formed, because a lot of the unionism for federation was based partially on the vulnerability of how small our population was. It was based on, back then, on racial lines, racist lines. And the unionism of Australia does fit along historically with that type of racial prejudice because of the vulnerability of its place at the end of just below Indonesia. But nevertheless, it's a very poignant issue. From what you talked about, I was very interested to also find out that you talked about him being the head of Planned Parenthood, or being connected to that link. I was really interested because I also knew about people like Emmeline Pankhurst and all these other first wave suffragette feminists, just looking into the history they had against. They were very pro-eugenics. That first wave of feminists were actually thought that would probably have read Stoddard's work and actually been very pro his work. And this big fight in the US, you might know about. I saw on I think Time Ghost History once in the Between the Wars kind of series. There was one of the biggest people advocates for for racial harmony was actually these religious Presbyterians and Catholics who were against abortion and eugenics on the basis of it being religiously immoral. And then when it came to this kind of situation, he ended up denouncing this. And it wasn't Emmeline Pankhurst, it was like another woman who was very pro the eugenics, and she ends up suing him or something like that, despite the fact he did this, speech to less than 30, 20 people or something like that, and was barely anyone heard it. Somehow she tried suing him. So it was such an interesting it was such an interesting situation where eugenics was seen as a progressive issue back then, and a way of controlling the population of what they saw as socially undesirable populations who are just less well off. Such an interesting sort of period where what they saw as progressive versus conservative was completely dissimilar to what was completely completely different to the way we see things now. So I'll let you go from now, because obviously I'm going off my soapbox.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Australia during that time, because I know that the Immigration Restriction Act in 1901, after you guys were federated around that time, that the kind of idea was very popular within Parliament, right, and had support from various parties. But I think, as you said, in the case of Australia as well, a lot of the opponents were more Christian factions of politics during that time. I believe this guy, Peter Cochrane, in his book Best We Forget, about Australia in World War One, pointed that out, as well as kind of the paranoia that existed specifically in Australia. You mentioned the small population and the proximity to Southeast Asia. I think it was exacerbated by basically the relative decline of British naval power during the early 20th century. With the rise of German naval power, of course, Britain sought to balance its forces more towards the Baltic Sea, and as a result, it basically outsourced security in the Pacific Ocean to Imperial Japan due to the Anglo-Japanese alliance signed around, I think, just after you guys were federated. But that, in particular, caused a lot of disquiet in Australia, because there was the idea that it was just ripe for the taking by Japan, and that basically Britain would not defend them, would not defend Australia from Japan, because it had entrusted Japan with the security of the entire Eastern Hemisphere, and therefore there was the convergence of events during the early 20th century that kind of compounded the particular anxieties in the antipodes. I think in the U.S., it was more restricted to the West Coast, where there was this strong fear of Asian migration because of labor demands with westward expansion, as well as the fact that just the eastern seaboard had been settled for so long that it had a sufficient population base, and therefore I think in Australia there was a more acute kind of fear. But in Australia, I think there was a similar trajectory after World War II in terms of people's attitudes, right? Because I think the White Australia policy began to be dismantled over time under Menzies, and then finally was scrapped altogether under Whitlam, if I'm not mistaken. But I think the kind of end of Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War could be seen as the critical point at which the kind of early paranoias had been eradicated, because by that point, I think most Australians kind of had the attitude that the involvement in forward defense had failed, and that it was wiser to seek security through cooperation with the neighboring region rather than seeking to be shielded from it, and the idea of kind of a moral responsibility due to the involvement in Indochina that they should take in the refugees from the region. So I think that's sort of the concluding chapter in Australian attitudes towards Asia. And since then, of course, you guys have lots of Asian immigration. So it's kind of just interesting historical development that within the broader Anglosphere, and maybe perhaps the West in general, there was this just such a dramatic shift in people's opinions over the course of the 20th century. The sort of start of the critical inflection points, I'd say, are probably the end of World War II, and that, as we discussed earlier, the post-war transition, and then finally like midway through the Cold War with the Vietnam experience when it comes to attitudes towards Asia. So I'll pass it to you guys.
I suppose if I can, I could probably tack on as well on this topic. From, Yuan Shikai and China's perspective, in some ways it was probably more like, dislike of mainly white Western groups. And I'd probably say, obviously, you can't really blame them for that, as Yuan Shikai was already born a few decades after the so-called Century of Humiliation started, which was basically after the end of the First Opium War that forced open some of the first ports in China and ceded Hong Kong Island to the British. So obviously with that, Yuan Shikai tried to stop, even Japanese colonization and at first mainly at the expense of the Chinese influence in Korea, but the first Sino-Japanese War, they also lost Taiwan. But also the whole Boxer Rebellion thing was essentially, obviously trying to get rid of, not even two birds with one stone, but many birds with one stone with all the, quite literally just about at that point, every single major power on earth at that point. But obviously, that unfortunately for them entirely failed. And the long century of humiliation only really ends, depending on your point of view. But most people would say around the end of the Civil War, around 1949, 1950. I guess in some ways as well, Yuan Shikai, like I said before, he was opportunistic, but at least going on early in his life as well, he liked to at least maybe delude himself that he wanted to help China. I think it's a bit of both sort of thing. Like, I think he generally, when he made himself become emperor, even though he stacked the democracy at that point, and while it was never proven, for example, when Sun Yat-sen, as he promised in return for Yuan getting the last emperor to abdicate, a lot of Yuan's political enemies were conveniently killed at the same time. So, but when he made himself become emperor, he was trying to say that China isn't ready to become a democracy yet. It's had, literally thousands of years of autocratic rule. It needs some time to, recover and particularly go under a pan-ethnic emperor first, because previously they were under a Manchu Tungusic dynasty, the Qing Dynasty. But obviously, there was a little bit of opportunism there too. Like, there's no way he wouldn't have just thought, oh, cool, I can grab for some power. Because I think he also was interested, I don't know if it was him, but at least some of his followers in the so-called Beiyang government, the one usually controlled by the army, which lasted until about 1923, ultimately got China into the First World War. For that sort of very reason, like similar with just, say, Thailand when they entered the war, to essentially try to improve China's image around the globe and try to sort of renegotiate those unequal treaties because of, and that sort of fear and dislike of Western influence goes long into even like Maoist China. Like I mentioned before, Time Ghost, which I'm glad he did. I watched many of those videos from them. In the equivalent of the Between the Two Wars series, but after World War II in Water War, they talk about Mao, I think towards the end of the Civil War, had basically told the Westerners to, piss off from China, and apparently even shelled some, I think it was even like British or American ships. Basically unapologetic, we don't really care what this looks like anymore. You've been here long enough, you've pillaged our sort of society long enough, it's time you left. So similar sort of thing, obviously expressed a bit differently than how the West expressed that same sort of racism. But similar sort of idea.
This is just all getting really fascinating, actually, to be completely honest with you. I was very interested just to think a bit about, you were right, Sunshine. We had dismantled a lot of that system kind of going forward. We'd had multiple waves, as I talked about in my episode or Walt's podcast that I did with Sasquatch, who will be in a subsequent episode. I discussed that we had very planned post-World War II recovery program, and I wrote an article about it on my own Substack called What is White If It Doesn't Matter? And the idea is I was reflecting along a little bit about that immigration wave that came and that was focused on continental Europe, that my grandparents came along with, and so that's where you got the majority of your Greeks, Baltics, and like your Jewish population as well. My great-grandfather had a brother, and he had moved to Sydney to practice dentistry before the war, and then just before the outbreak. And then when the outbreak happened, he knew my great-grandfather took, his wife and, my grandfather, his son, when he was a teenager, through Poland, through Hungary, and eventually to try and get to Switzerland or Sweden to move to Australia to join his brother. And obviously they ended up going through Bergen-Belsen and stuff like that, and surviving Bergen-Belsen. There was a chance they could have ended up at Auschwitz, but they're lucky they were had some connections to the American Zionists. I've actually found out they had some money. They had some connections through the Zionist sort of activism situation scene in Eastern Galicia, and so that whole Polish intelligentsia would have been in touch with the people from the States, the Jewish population in the States, like New York and wherever else. And at that point, the darkest time, there was a Hungarian businessman called Reza Kustner. And Reza Kustner had bribed Adolf Eichmann to let 700 Jews or something like that leave Hungary and to safety and avoid Auschwitz. And my grandpa and my grandpa were part of that train. When they got on the train, my great grandpa said to my grandfather, "Okay, there's a 50-50 chance that this ends up at Auschwitz or ends up in our freedom." And then my grandfather was like, "Well, 50-50 is probably the most certain thing I've ever heard, so let's just take 50-50. And so it's just, it kind of got to that stage where Bergen-Belsen wasn't nearly as bad as, it was probably the equivalent of maybe a gulag, probably a little bit better than a gulag, to be completely honest with you. Because a gulag, at least, it's in freezing, in the middle of the Czech Republic, or wherever this place was, Bergen, I forget where it was. It was just, freezing cold and all that sort of stuff, but they're just forced to do labor, and they were occasionally fed. It was really weird. My grandpa would say that they would not get any food for ages, and then suddenly some Nazi officer, since they weren't treated as badly, would just be like, "Oh shit, we should get some food for you, eh?" And then they just come out with a truck full of crustaceans and lobsters and fish and just dump it on the ground, and then ever see this pile of lobsters and crayfish and all that just out of a truck. And they're like, "Eat, you need to eat." And it's like, "Oh, okay." And they just run over and they just start eating it. And my grandfather was like, that didn't happen very often, but I would never forget it. It was very funny. He had a great sense of humor about this stuff, my grandfather. But I guess the reason I brought it up is that this wave of immigration that occurred, it was very planned. And I think, look, I know the White Australia policy, some people try to argue why didn't they just get rid of it straight up. It was planned, and it was dismantled in procedural sort of stages so that the population recovery wasn't tumultuous, and it wasn't fast changing, or it wasn't completely unruly. Because of the situation we are currently, there was a protest that was on today, the August 31st, when I stayed well clear away from, and I put on my Substack, I did not go to that. I'm not associating with any of that shit. I don't know anything to do with it. Anyway, I was looking at some of the shit on the news today and what was coming out of it. I was just having to think, and I was like, look, I agree. I've looked at, some of the stuff that our Department of Home Affairs kind of publishes, and, the fact is, over the before the 2020 or something like that, over his 2000s and that, our first source of most immigration came from Britain and from Europe, and that was mainly the case since World War II. But over that, the last 20 or so years with international students and investment and that sort of thing, the number one is India now, number two is China, number three is the Philippines, number four is Nepal, and number five is the UK. And it's UK is literally the only European language speaking country in that entire top 10. So it's absolutely I don't know, you're talking about a total reorientation. That's a total reorientation. And I don't know, I wouldn't try to say that we should dial back the clock, because that's what these protesters wanted. They just want to dial back the clock. Now, well, we could dial back the clock or just completely. But I mean, the only thing I advocate for personally is the kind of world that my parents grew up in. So the 80s and 90s, because back then, a lot of immigrants were just building their communities in the 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s, are building them, and you had to make a lot of effort working with the broader population of Australia who'd already been there to make things work and make business work and actually make your life work. But then nowadays, it's even immigrants who second gen, third gen here will all say, "My parents came in the 80s and 90s." But now the ones who come here, join the community, they just take advantage of it. Just waltz on in. They don't need to do all the effort that we did. We just did all the heavy lifting for them. And so there's this interesting multi-ethnic sort of criticism of how fast things are changing in Australia. that I've noticed. It's very multi-ethnic, this criticism. If they've been second or third generation, there's this frustration that things have changed too quickly, and people have become, there's this linguistic cultural isolationism in certain suburbs, like where I'm currently living. It's a place called Burwood. And Burwood, I was living in Marrickville before, but I got priced out thanks, Sydney rents and that. I'm not going to say where I live in Burwood because I don't want to dox myself. But what I'm trying to say is this suburb used to be like known for its shopping centre, the Westfield, and like the cinemas and that sort of thing. And then slowly but surely it became kind of like, it's got the Burwood Chinatown. It's got all this, great bubble tea places on it, but Burwood Road. But the thing is like, it wasn't known for that. Like when I was a kid, it was the place that like had the big shops and Broadway shopping centre near the Ultimo. Jish and I went to school. Was not fully built yet, so everyone went to Burwood, and now it's just like Haymarket or Eastwood or Chatswood Mark V. And so it's interesting to see how these things change, and a lot of people think about these kinds of things, and I guess some of these attitudes I try to stay away from. Obviously, today were kind of you president, people, everyone thinks about them, but it's interesting to see what the landscape's been like. I'll pass over to Jish because I wouldn't mind getting his analysis on what you've been saying, Sunshine.
Yeah, no, I can see where Stern's coming from with that. I'll probably say it's impressive. So I work with the Department of Home Affairs. Of course, my views are of my own, and I don't represent the government or the people of Australia. Yeah, Parramatta is a good example, probably one of the best examples in general, whatever your opinion is on immigration and development, because 20 years ago, so I sometimes went to Parramatta like when I was younger, because I think my parents used to work there, at least sometimes. It was actually quite fairly parochial. It had some like high rises, but like on the smaller end of things. It was very white though, almost like Penrith, which it kind of is. Penrith in Sydney is like the far western, still considered bogan sort of area in Sydney. Like Parramatta was a bit like that, except maybe slightly less dodgy and all. But yeah, there was like hardly any, just say, Indians in sight. And now, like 20 years on, there's sky rises everywhere, and it's literally marketed as the second CBD in Sydney. They moved everything out there, like even some of the state museums, like the Powerhouse Museum. I think the Department of Home Affairs, which all of that used to obviously be in the main Sydney CBD, because it's probably where all the state offices are, and easier for communication there, has now moved to Parramatta, possibly for that reason, both for the second CBD, and that's where a lot of immigrants tend to go. So Stern's right about that. Like they started rolling back the White Australia policy, though I've never personally heard it was because for sustainability reasons they slowly took it down. I think it was like after the Second World War, a lot of immigrants from Europe, war-torn Europe in particular, started coming over here. And even back then, it was unprecedented. Like now it doesn't quite have a racist connotation, but the so-called term of wog came from that sort of period of time. Like it doesn't just mean like black person, which is what I think they understand it as in America. It was literally like the sort of Italian, Greek, olive-skinned immigrant, usually with black hair. Like I've met some people before in my time, for example, like some older generation people when I used to do meditation. And one guy there said, and he pretty much just looks like me, but with like blacker hair and slightly darker skinned. And he said, I think he came to Australia in the 50s, and the school, had like probably so-called Aryan stereotypical looking people, rough skinned, blonde haired guys, and they'd always sort of, I don't know if it was harsh bullying, but they would always sort of like pull at his hair or something, because it was like, for them, it was weird to see black hair. And then after the Vietnam War, partly is what Stern said as well, because we felt that we had a sort of ethical obligation to help the Vietnamese. And to be fair, at least the southern Vietnamese, who are most of the Vietnamese population coming to Australia, they were literally our allies, which is also why now, if you know the flags, a lot of the Vietnamese community here, like in Lidcombe, for example, has not the standard Vietnamese flag. It has the old South Vietnamese flag. I think SBS as well, which is the equivalent of our international multilingual channel here was also set up during that time to cater to all the Vietnamese immigrants. I think after that anyway, because towards the end of the Vietnam War, especially when we were involved, I think the White Australia policy ended around 72, 73, probably closer to 72. Yeah, after that, it was just slowly but steadily a lot more multicultural sort of migration, which became very obvious coming to the 21st century. So, yeah.
Pass on to Sunshine. I find it really interesting talking about that there too. That whole period. It'd be interesting, Sunshine, if you can go into like that world that Stoddard had lived in and talk a little bit about, even like Wilson's day, my period that D'Annunzio's from, because that period, I know Wilson was involved in all these great progressive reformations, but since he was one of these Southern Dixie Democrats, he was also involved in this in reinstituting racial segregation into the government, into all government departments. So like crazy shit like that, like seen as progressive. It's interesting, but like I'll let you take it away. I just thought it'd be interesting to kick off with that.
Yeah, and also comment on what Jish said about the flags. It's also the case in most parts of the U.S. They have the old RVN flag if you go to a Vietnamese area, but here in Korea, you don't see it at all because obviously they didn't have even though Korea participated in the Vietnam War, they're still a poor country, so they didn't take refugees in back then. But now there are a lot of Vietnamese workers in Korea, but you only see the communist flag because they're recent arrivals. But yeah, in terms of the early 20th century world and Woodrow Wilson, I know that, of course, Wilson was famous for his 12 points during the Versailles Conference, where he was talking a lot about national sovereignty and self-determination, and this led to an appeal to the U.S. in a lot of countries that were under colonial occupation, and they kind of thought, oh, maybe this is kind of our windfall, and we can get the U.S. to support independence. And I think Ho Chi Minh was one of the people who saw this as a viable route. There was also an independence movement in Korea, but Wilson's view was he was talking about what he considered the civilized countries, meaning the West as well as Japan, and probably also countries in Latin America that had been independent for a while, and he saw these countries as capable of self-government. Other countries as requiring the tutelage of the civilized world before they could be granted independence. And he held these people during this time held those views for differing reasons. So there were people like Wilson, as you mentioned, who just had kind of like racist views in general, like his attitudes towards black people that you mentioned. But there are also, I think, a lot of people during that time period just saw their transition period as necessary for different countries to gain independence. And there's actually a lot of nationalists in third world countries had this view as well. Like I think it was Phan Chu Trinh in Vietnam who thought that there needed to be a continuity of French rule for some time, and then they could eventually be put on the path to full independence after embracing kind of republic. In addition, the unequal treaties just mentioned that had been imposed on China had also been imposed on Japan in the 19th century, and the kind of responses to this imposition couldn't be starker, right? Because China basically got saddled with it and then went into kind of a dilapidated political state for multiple decades, whereas in the case of Japan, they realized as much as we may dislike having to lick the West's boots for some time, this is pretty much the only viable options. Just adopt not only technology but institutions from the West, and then once those are established, we can revise the treaties, which they did. And Wilson himself, despite having like these racist views, did make an agreement with Japan to regulate immigration to the U.S. that would not be slapping them in the face diplomatically, called the Gentleman's Agreement, where basically he said, if you could just agree not to send immigrants to the U.S., Japan won't be targeted in Oriental exclusion laws, or immigration from Japan will not be legally limited. As a result, Japanese mostly moved to Brazil, Peru, and to Hawaii because it was not yet incorporated as a state. And basically all of the unequal treaties by the early 20th century had been disestablished with Japan, earned the status as a peer of the West. And Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt both kind of had this admiration for the country, whereas I think China, as far as I know, and I'm no sinologist, was basically trapped with the status until the end of its civil war. And I suspect Jish could probably fill in the gaps of the details that I'm leaving with that.
Yeah, no, that's actually quite fascinating. I didn't know much about that gentleman's agreement thing that had been organized for Japan. It's an interesting one too because you mentioned Peru. When I was doing my Catholic conversion on campus, there was a woman. She was Japanese, ethnically Japanese, but she only spoke Spanish, and she was from this Peruvian order of consecrated laywomen who'd brought me into the church. And I've been told by friends of hers in that community that her family had been blackbirded, so her family had been taken by Peru and brought in to incentivize all these Japanese people to move to Peru because of the fact that there'd be great farming lands there. And Peru is very mountainous, and there's not a great amount of farming land. So that compared to what they were sold, and so they ended up just being stuck in with no recourse to get back to Japan, and so they just had to learn Spanish, and they forgot their Japanese. Like, it's sad, but that's what happened. Very interesting, actually, that these little obscurities happen, but they're very significant obscurities that you don't get taught. I'll let Jish kind of comment on the issue too, but I thought I'd just quickly tie in where my topic is. When this topic of the popularity of the Italian Risorgimento, which means the it was like kind of like a recuperation, or like a regaining of all the old lost land of the Roman Empire, and the pride of Italy sort of was coming about. D'Annunzio, in his occupation before the Italian Navy ended up just bombarding it, surprisingly, he didn't even die. He was taken back later on. They'd set up an independent republic in Fiume. So it was like a city-state. And it was like that for about 3 years. And they had, it would revolve around who would be, with which ethnic group was allowed to rule, become, the governor of Fiume. So first it was an Italian, and then next it was, it had to be or Serb, and it would alternate. And then that would keep going until Mussolini annexed Fiume into Italy. And he just started annexing all these other countries, like Albania, and obviously there's all these areas in the Balkans which Mussolini just wanted to gobble up after that, and it was like at that moment, like with D'Annunzio, he felt like he wanted he was one man and with a cult of following. And there was all this Mussolini's Fasci di Combattimento, they called it, or the Combatants League, or the League of Combatants, was basically just a union for, more or less, you could see it like as a union for washed up World War One soldiers who weren't ever given a pension and were disappointed with the fact that they hadn't been given the lands that they were promised by England and France. So much like the Arabs in the Middle East, they'd been promised all these lands and they never got them for helping them in World War. The Italians were pissed off, but they couldn't. Their hands were tied by the US and various other powers. They couldn't get them, and obviously the Yugoslavs was not going to surrender themselves to become part of the Italian Empire. So it was an interesting sort of state of affairs, and this guy's just like, fuck this, I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to set my own occupation up. It's just one of these people of history you just could not have made up. I'll let Jish comment on the issue, but I just thought I'd tie that in.
Yeah, I can tie into both ends of that. Yeah, first of Sunshine. To be honest, I probably should know, but I'm not entirely sure why China couldn't sort of modernize as well as Japan did and come out of its sort of quagmire. My only assumption would otherwise be the Qing Dynasty was ruled by a tiny minority overall. Like, for example, today, the Manchu was one of the bigger minorities in China. I think all minorities in China only amount to about 5%. Most of China is dominated by the so-called Han ethnicity. And I think the Manchu make up like 2 or 3% of that. So I think they had more of a concept of keeping on to power as much as possible. So that usually shelved any attempts at genuine sort of modernization. I think, at least in terms of the First Sino-Japanese War, for example, even though the newly made Beiyang army, who Yuan Shikai was the general over, was actually as modernized at that point though as the Japanese Navy. So I think they were like semi-steel battleships at that point. They had some more modernized uniforms. Apparently they did better on land as well, all that sort of stuff. And basically all Western observers and everyone else was expecting the Japanese to actually lose. In the end, not only did the Japanese win, but decisively so. I've heard before, though, there was a lot of sort of internal corruption, and I think because, again, due to nepotism and probably the conservatives gripping onto power, there was a lot less of the meritocracy that we see today in today's armies, like, Yuan Shikai buying titles to quickly go up ranks. And obviously that makes big difference when you have, just say, a random tough gentry in charge of the army, like maybe 2 seconds or something, compared to someone who's effectively worked up from private or officer or the equivalent of. Yeah, going back to this sort of irredentist politics that I was talking about as well. Obviously, a little bit after Yuan Shikai died, but I think, again, his faction was interested, at least eventually, in joining the First World War. China expected when they joined the war, I think around later 1917, that they could start revising some of their unequal treaties, which was mainly about at least taking back some of the concessions that the Western powers had taken from them. However, China only really fought the war internally in China itself, basically taking the Austrian and German concessions, which is why they weren't represented in Versailles. But in response, there were major protests called the July Movement in China, so in July 1919, which did actually help with international pressure. I think Woodrow Wilson even got involved and was basically like, all right, fair enough, there won't be any withdrawing of any concessions, but we will no longer, enforce more sort of unequal sort of treaties and concessions within China. But basically, Japan was furious of this, in which they had already made their own, I forgot how many point agreements they had, but it was something like the 18-point agreement or something like that, that they also signed with Yuan Shikai, which practically made China a protectorate starting around 1914, because I think Yuan also partially signed that for his own interest to become the Hongxian emperor. But yeah, through US pressure again, they slowly started diluting that point agreement until it was just about completely diluted into nothing by about 1919. And of course there was the, I think it was called the Washington Agreement in terms of the naval capping. So that at the meantime sort of disrupted Japan's influence in China until the Mukden incident and their first invasion of Manchuria in 1931. So yeah, I'll leave that for Sunshine to comment on.
Yeah, I think the Washington Agreement capped Imperial Japanese Navy to 3/5 of the Royal Navy and the U.S. Navy, but the exchange was that the U.S. can fortify beyond Hawaii and Britain can do it beyond Singapore. But I think during that, the Washington Treaty also basically led to disestablishment of the Anglo-Japanese alliance, therefore kind of put Japan on a bit of a path towards kind of becoming more of a having to look out for its interests independently of the British Empire, which obviously set them up for a collision course down the line. Of course, that would take another decade because during the 20s, Japan was still quasi-democratic, rather than being kind of fascistic. I think with the Versailles Conference at the end of World War One, another thing that Japan had proposed, I think more for kind of moral posturing than serious seeking, was an equality clause, a racial equality clause that was meant basically to apply between the victors of World War One, so not towards countries that were under their rule. And it was actually the U.S. under Wilson and Australia that blocked that from being passed. I think the motivation behind that in Wilson's case is obvious, and in the case of Australia was done because they don't want to open the immigration wave to Japan due to the kind of anxieties we had discussed earlier. I think with the case of the modernization of the Chinese army in the late Qing Dynasty, the advantage Japan had was that they had kind of decided to enter the road of westernization earlier on by just following the Meiji Restoration in 1868, and they have been able to select which countries whose institutions they want to adopt. So initially they hired French army advisors, but then after the Franco-Prussian War, they switched to Prussian ones, and they were most impressed with Prussia of all the Western countries they had studied and modeled their constitution after it as well. But in the case of their navy, they went to the Royal Navy because it was, of course, the best in the world. And I think, though, by the time of the First Sino-Japanese War, they still lacked the industrial capacity to create their own kind of modern warships, so they had to purchase them from Britain even up through the Russo-Japanese War. But I think China had a bit of a later start because they had to go through losing 2 opium wars before finally deciding to get with the times, whereas Japan could observe China's decline and then respond more wisely. In the case of Korea, interestingly, the modernization began in the 1880s. After, in 1875, right, Japan had imposed its own unequal treaty on Korea, and in response, Korea began a modernization program after a coup d'etat in I think 1883. The Sino-Japanese War, I think, basically cut it short because it had forced the Treaty of Shimonoseki had forced China to relinquish any claims of influence over Korea, which gave Japan a freer hand, and then finally the Russo-Japanese War stripped it of its sovereignty and gave Japan its first colony other than Formosa or Taiwan. So Japan just kind of lucked out, I think, with its modernization pattern because it began late enough to see what would happen if it didn't follow this path, but early enough that it wouldn't be subject to predation by countries that did. And it seems like China really was stuck, not realizing its potential for so many generations because of these mistakes, whereas now Japan is even worse than a lot of countries in Europe in terms of its falling behind economically and its lack of military capacity and so on, whereas China, of course, is on the cutting edge for AI, quantum computing, etc. So the times have changed. This is something, I guess, that couldn't have been foreseen during the time period of all these figures we've been discussing, but I'll pass it back to Mr. Gollum.
Thanks, Sunshine. It kind of gets richer and richer, to be completely honest with you. I really like your posts, and I mainly have listened to more of your podcasts appearances and read more of your notes, and I've had the chance to read some of your work because for some reason it never pops up for me. So you've got to send it to me because I have to usually try to set whenever I post something, I try to send stuff to a few closed circle of people like yourself and stuff, so people can actually read my stuff because sometimes it just gets lost in the ether. But it's such an interesting one because that whole sector of, like, when you talked with Walt about, you know, your episode on the stupidity of passport bros, and by this, you know, I sent it to Jish, that episode, because I wanted them to get to know what you some of your work before you came on here. He was originally, Jish was like, "Oh, what do you mean? Isn't it normal for, like, people want to travel?" But when we actually listened to the whole episode, it was very clear what you were implying. You were talking about, like, the stupidity of passport bros who basically have no idea what about the culture's like, and they just end up in this place, and then they just want to find a life. And it's like, if you've done the research and that sort of thing, and you actually want to, like, make an effort to integrate in that culture, a fascination for it, more or less what a traveler does, or a so like some kind of itinerant does, and whether you find love there, that's like kind of like a byproduct. But if you just go in, like, you know, American tourist, you know, stereotype of, like, you know, his flesh is spilling out of his shirt, you know, walking around, you know, with the stars and stripes on, you know, goes into the nearest McDonald's and starts texting random women saying, "Meet me at McDonald's. We're going to be starting here." You know, obviously that's a menace. That guy's a sexual menace. I was kind of thinking a little bit about that, and I don't know. It's just that Asia's become so interesting. I was in Thailand at the beginning of the year, and you were traveling. I noticed on Substack at that point you were traveling in Vietnam. Had I had more time, I probably would have gone to Vietnam. And I met these British people, and they were traveling, doing the whole loop of. I was in Chiang Mai, and then I went down to Bangkok, and then I had like a month in Thailand. This is my first time probably in Asia too. Like the rest of the time, just sort of been to Europe basically. I went to Alaska when I was 3 years old. Barely remember it. So it was like one of these things, just, you know, first probably time in Asia. And I was originally going to go to Japan, do the whole Japan thing everyone's doing. You can fly to Japan from Australia right now for like less than, you know, you can get an $800 return ticket. It's just, that's the equivalent of what, like 600 American bucks or something. It's like, brilliant. But I at the time they had ski season, so I really know it was like winter time in like the winter sort of period in Japan. So then everyone going to that northernmost island, it became like more expensive, and so it was like the equivalent of flying to like almost like to London at that point of the year. So I just thought, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to at least save some money. So I went to Thailand instead because I only think $1,000 return. Ended up paying a bit more to reroute some flights for a friend, and he ended up shouting me a Muay Thai fight, which was cool. But the Chiang Mai, I learnt a lot in Thailand actually, and the interesting part of it for me was finding out that it was an imperialist power of its own right. So it actually had ended up joining, being like that Italy in the situation of the Japan World War II situation when they jumped on board with declared war on the US, and obviously the US doesn't give lots of a shit this tiny country with elephants and war elephants and stuff. But back in the day, it was the imperial power of Southeast Asia. They like to tell me, that the Vietnamese under their strap, they had the Cambodians under their strap, and the Burmese under their strap. But in order to maintain their independence, they did deals with the French and the English to give away parts of their territories in each of these respective new colonies to be able to maintain their independence from the rest of the Western world. And this was like Japan in much of this regard, because Japan, had this independence and this great empire, which had, taken over, and they didn't want to. The West obviously wanted to kind of curtail it because it had its own interest in Asia, but it didn't. Obviously these countries were sophisticated and had this leveraging opportunity to give land away in exchange for independence and not to be invaded themselves. And I found that fascinating. And that's kind of why when I read in Jish's article, I think which one was one of them, where I found out about this, them joining the Japanese in World War II for a split second. I found that the funniest thing, because it's based on this old, it kind of clicked with me. It's based on this old, this old position that they felt like they had, which was like, oh, fuck, we're going to get our empires back. And obviously, I'm not sure if they ever did. It's funny to think that they were they were that ambitious. They were going to do what the Estonians and all the Baltics did, which then Stalin punished them for. So my mum's side of the family, she's got a great grandpa. She's got a grandpa, so my great grandpa on mum's side, I'll be writing an article about too. We're doing all this research. He was Estonian from Muhu Island and in the middle of the Baltic Sea, and he ended up leaving because he was originally he got blackbirded and going to Siberia, and then there was nothing there, so he ended up going to London and just being a cabin boy, work his way captain of the Merchant Navy. Ended up in New Zealand, Sydney, and then just gave up his job meeting a Scotswoman, and then had kids here in Sydney. So it was that whole thing was that he was displaced from after like a blackbirding sort of thing to try and settle this hinterland in the Siberia. There was all this push to settle hinterland in that time. So out in west coast of the United States, out in Peru, Brazil, Siberia, Australia, there was all this hinterland that everyone was trying to conquer. And they wouldn't care who they used, they just wanted someone. And so they had the Estonians try and set up these communities in Siberia. And obviously the Estonians couldn't really do a lot because it was all just permafrost. And the Estonians live in harsh conditions, much like the Finnish, but they're not magicians. They can't make crops grow in permafrost, no matter how much the Russians thought they could make it. But it was just this. It was very interesting. I don't know. I found that whole way that empires were just using other populations and blackbirding them heaps really interesting, because now you ended up with like people like Indians in Fiji, Indians in Zimbabwe, Estonians in Siberia and Siberia, Japanese people in Peru, just these completely random situations where because they just got tricked and they couldn't get back. And it's just such a fascinating background. I think something happened to Jish. He'll be back. I guess at that point, I was just thinking, well, yeah, I don't know. I'll pass it to you, Sunshine, just whilst Jish is trying to recover his internet connection. I don't know what happened there. He dropped out for a second, but he'll be back.
Well, we'll keep an eye on the messages. I think, I've never been to Thailand, but I've been to Vietnam 3 times, and I know Vietnam is also an imperial power back in the day where they basically wiped out the Chams down south, because originally it was Kingdom of Champa. It was also a lot of belonged to Cambodia, Khmer Empire, and the Viets expanded southward over time and eventually colonized the region. But it remained under the separate warlord from the north for a long period, and then both of them claimed to be ruling in the name of the emperor, sort of like Japan before during the Warring States period. My beef with Passport Bros is basically that I feel like they have this idea that people in other countries are like fundamentally more traditional than in the society they come from. But then, like, we live in an age of social media, the internet, and just mass globalization. Everyone can speak English now. Everyone's learning English nowadays. So I'm like, I feel like we kind of have converged to having some level of monoculture among young people globally. So it's kind of weird. They have this idea, especially that the people who would probably fit their image are the ones they're not even going to be able to communicate with, who live out in the middle of nowhere. That's always been my complaint about their worldview.
It's what I've noticed too is, well, you're right. You mentioned something too. When I was in Thailand, there's this stupidity which is I've noticed with just Western tourists, from very big countries too. Even like uneducated people from Australia and stuff. They think they could just rock up and get any fucking girl they want because, oh yeah, I'm white and I got a funny accent. And it's like, to some extent that's true, but then to a lot of extent it only works to a certain extent. So the bit where they find out that, this guy might not really have much of an education. They find out this guy is a bit of a drunk weirdo. They find out he's got all these social problems. It's like it's one of these things where it hits a logical dead end. And obviously there's the wealth disparity between some of these countries and like Australia and like the US and the Europe. So obviously there's that wealth pool. I think you mentioned in the episode that there was the thing apparently that the Korean government pays Korean citizens to go find wives, like unsuccessful Korean men. They pay them to go off to the South America and Eastern Europe. They all go to parts of Southeast Asia to find a wife and bring them back to Korea to try and boost the birth rate. I heard you mention fascinating. I haven't heard of anything like it, but I'm willing to believe it. I don't know. It's just sounds fascinating. This stuff exists. This whole thing of this, socially kind of dysfunctional situation that some guys find themselves in, and this lack of education or broad perspective on the world that some of them just do, and they'll just try and rock up to any bloody country that's a little bit less wealthy than theirs, and think they can just flash a greenback or something like that and think automatically get a wife. It's so funny.
Welcome back.
Thank you, guys. Yeah, sorry about that. Don't know why that happened. From what I heard, I think China sort of had its own equivalent. I don't know about blackbirding so much because it was China was still nominally independent, just had a lot of concessions. Although China could have seen itself become like India because the foreign powers are already drawing up spheres of influence such as Russia and Manchuria, Britain, I think mainly along the Yangtze and Pearl rivers, Japan and Anhui, France coming out from the Ningxia, I think that's called, maybe Yunnan. I think even Germany and Tsingtao and that sort of area. But there were a lot of cheap Chinese laborers that went around the world. They used to be pejoratively called coolies. I have no idea why they were called that, but I think even that term and those so-called coolies were used going up even to, say, I think Singapore at the end of its so-called clean-up period when it started really changing itself on the world stage by about the 80s onwards, still had those sort of cheap Chinese laborers. I think even in World War One, before they officially joined the war, since about something up to about 1 million at least, like a huge amount of cheap Chinese laborers were brought to usually the Entente side in the war to do everything from digging trenches to doing other sort of services and all. So you had pretty much a huge non-fighting sort of labor force in that sense. I see as well what Sunshine means now more with Passport Bros. I think we'd probably call them more like the equivalent of weeaboos or otakus here. No, I do get that because in my case, for example, I've happened just in my own life to have dated at least a handful of Asian women and all, but it's obviously never been like something as naive as like, oh, I'm Mr. Whitey or something. You're obviously already going to love me, and kiss my feet or something, because I think that'd be bloody stupid. And I, don't go around going kawaii desu. So I definitely have an appreciation of those cultures. I might not always understand it, obviously, or might not always agree with it. It's inevitable. But obviously, I try to respect that and make the differences work. Where usually the stereotypical parcel bros, usually sex tourists or weeaboos, they kind of have that. Like, I remember when I was a kid in the West, for example, anime and manga wasn't really that popular until the 2000s and late 90s. I'm sure the similar sort of trend started happening for Sunshine when he was in America, such as Sailor Moon, Dragon Ball Z, all those sorts of shows. They started getting English dubbed. Pokemon as well. But yeah, there was a little bit of a mismatch, obviously, between how usually Japanese or East Asians view their cartoons compared to in the West. So you had all these weird mistranslations and a lot of censoring on that. But yeah, because of that, a lot of interest in manga and anime didn't really occur until about the late 2000s. I think similar-ish with, just say, Korean and Chinese culture as well, such as the K-pop movement. I think that started coming through by about the early 2010s. Like, I remember Psy Gangnam Style, like everyone was about that back in the day. And I swear I almost never heard much about Korea in the mainstream before that time. So yeah, that's one thing that I did find annoying is a lot of people, it's obviously one thing to go, you love that part of, just say, Korean culture. But when you had a lot of these, weeaboos going around going, oh, I've heard the whole album of Twice from K-pop or one of those other groups. I don't know all the groups. Therefore, I'm so totally ready to go to Korea. The Korea boos, or I've seen the whole box set of this anime thing. I'm totally ready. They're really going to appreciate me. But of course not. Like, the equivalent is like when Americans come to Australia, just say, and I've met some of those Americans, and I think they never mean to be rude about it, but they're kind of naive about it. Like, some of these Americans, they'll be going, where are you from? And they'll be like, in Australia. Oh, Australia, good day, mate. And they'll be going like, yeah, we have the Outback Steakhouse, shrimp on the barbie. It's all that sort of ridiculous stereotypical stuff. But yeah, no, I get you. I entirely get what you mean. The appreciation and integration always comes first. And just obviously giving, patience over, in a different country, and not expecting people to immediately come to you. Like, personally, I don't know if I would ever emigrate, but I would probably at least go, if I go to these countries, I would kind of be expected to be seen as a bit of an alien, not like, make myself disrespected, but, I'd kind of expect and understand if they sort of look at me as a bit different, maybe even a bit weird. It's just a natural human response. Like, when I was in Korea, apparently not even all my friends had the same experience, but a lot of Korean women would literally, even talking to their friends, would then look at me and be like wide-eyed as anything, and then just like trail me as they walked along. It was such a weird experience. I even asked my cousin, who used to work as an English teacher in Korea for a few years. I was actually for once getting really self-aware, and I was like, oh, why are they doing this? Do they think I'm ugly or like weird whitey guy or something? She said apparently the complete opposite. Like, they at least find me interesting looking, maybe even good looking or whatever. But yeah, it's still a weird feeling, like them sort of looking at you with the wide eyes. I don't really get offended by it though, because it's a very monocultured kind of country. I think at the time as well I had a moustache, which compared to, just say, Japan, they're even less used to in Korea. Like, I had some people comment on that. They're I think the same thing. Oh no, not in Japan so much. I don't know about China, but they're quite forward in Korea. A lot of foreigners have said that, like almost to the point, according to them, that they see it as kind of rude. I guess I'm not used to it, but again, it wasn't so bad when they'd look at me, even some guys, and they go, oh yeah, you look quite handsome, except for the moustache. And again, it's like, oh, it's just one thing. I'm not used to that, but it's one sort of form of constructive criticism, and I was expecting that anyway. In a lot of Asian countries, when men don't usually grow or can grow much facial hair anyway. I mean, to be honest, neither can I. It'd be interesting to see how I go when I go to Japan in about 9 or 10 days' time, see if there's any differing reactions. So I think similar happens in China, though, like we were talking about before, because of how long. No, I think that's still because of a huge Han population there. There might be, I don't know, yeah, there might be a similar amount of a small minority of Westerners in China, and so they might have a kind of a similar reaction.
Kind of curious to ask both of you. Jish, you mentioned like what a lot of times Americans are in Australia, we're like, oh, shrimp on the Barbie, crocodile Dundee, all this stuff. I think Americans like kind of view Australia as like this kind of wild frontier country, but then I get the impression it's kind of the opposite, where it's like very urbanized, and like Australia, seems like very kind of restrictive with like has a lot of rules with certain things, like about like public drinking, wearing a helmet when you ride a motorcycle, and this kind of stuff. I'm like, do you guys think that's accurate? Like, do you think that the American stereotype is like the opposite of modern Australia and that's like outdated, or do you think that like how do you think about these kinds of images Americans have?
I'll quickly butt in on that one before I'll let pass it just because I do have some interesting points on this. So I work in an industry as an engineer in fire safety, and a lot of this kind of work we do is along compliance and designing solutions which can meet compliance requirements within our building code. And now these things might be seen as like hurdles, but they're not. They're like assurance documents to make sure things can be as robust as possible. In Australia, we have a bit of an obsession with what I'm doing is actually help people comply. I work with a team, but I spit draft documents and do modeling and stuff like that to help people comply and meet performance requirements, similar to like what fire engineers do in the States. And with the NFPA and, like the American standards and NIST, pieces like that. But the thing is like the fact that we have what you'll find is actually in the cities, we're so obsessed with this safetyism, and we're so obsessed with protecting what independence Australia has that we're trying to always look fucking tough. So we're always like, no, you can't bring that pineapple from Indonesia. No, you can't bring that wooden club from Fiji. Look at this one termite hole. You got to incinerate that or pay us thousands of dollars to sanitize it. I was like, fuck's sake. And I ended up losing some like wooden trinkets I brought back from Fiji when I was like 14. It's fucking sucked because they just found, like a little termite hole in it. And I'm just like, okay, yeah. I talked to my dad about it, and he's like, no, it's a good thing because we have bringing termites from overseas and then they're going to eat all the forests. And then I'm like, or something like that, cause diseases and stuff like that. Because we had my dad was born in England. He wasn't allowed to donate blood in Australia because of the fact that there was mad cow disease. So it's one of these situations where just strict island sort of thing where we're a sanctuary, but we're also like, super fucking strict about what comes in and out sometimes. But I also find it's also just a bit of an overcorrection. It's like, it's a bit ridiculous, especially in some of these more Labour, left-wing sort of states. I think sometimes Labour does good work, but then there's times where they just completely, especially in Victoria, the safetyism button is up. It's like, it's so far, pressed in that it's basically like, I don't know, they've just broken their finger at this point. Is what they've got over in like, this, you see this stuff. I had to bring up like with these popular Sky News issues, but there's this transition period that they've got. They don't want to admit to the big thing about the machete wielding gangs. They talk about the machete bins that everyone's been talking about. Obviously that shit's stupid, but it's like this idea that they're even copying the UK and Victoria right now with this stupid knife ban, machete ban thing. And I'm thinking, I mean, Jish could probably have his own things because he has his own views on these kinds of matters than I do. But I personally think there's so much industry in Australia just to enforce rules. So it's like there's a job you can get as a fire practitioner, and that in my industry, and that's not a fire safety engineer, it's a fire practitioner. And your job is you could get paid hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to do it. And all you just do is one of my old colleagues who became an engineer as a fire practitioner, and he's like, oh, my job is just to go to random Chinese restaurants and just shake down these old people so they would update the extinguishers and smoke alarms to the latest standard. Otherwise, we'd like threaten to shut them down or something. They wouldn't do that, but they'd propose fines, get the authorities involved, make their life uncomfortable. And obviously, these old Chinese shops run by these old Chinese grandparents, obviously don't speak the most English, and you're going to give them the fright of their fucking life. And it's just there's such an industry to enforce compliance in Australia and design solutions to help comply and that kind of thing. So it's seen as our competitive advantage that we're so fucking strict, and it's just, it has its advantages, like, you know, having really good beef, having really good, you know, quality fruit, having really good quality, you know, produce, and like safe buildings and stuff like that. But at the same time, like, I think some of this, like, I went to Thailand and I'm just seeing people ride without helmets, and, you know, fucking, you know, rent is fucking cheap. You know, people just living in some fully renovated place super quickly, and then when they do construction works, literally just done within like a few hours. And obviously, you know, it's done in patchwork style, and like, you know, there's power lines hanging down to the ground. You gotta, you know, you're not worried that if you touch, you might get zapped to death. But and the electrical engineering and soldering on those power lines is not exactly very up to scratch. Let's just say that it looks like a forest of wires when you look at those power lines. But nevertheless, like, it's just, things are done so much more like ad hocly than Australia is, and there's so many fucking delays in Australia just to comply with all these basic things. And then when there's these delays, crooks try to take advantage of it and take a rort, and, you know, like a rort meaning like a scam. They just try to take the whole thing for a ride, and lawsuits, backlogs, you know, and in the delay time and all the confusion, you'll get people just juggling. You know, I was working in a company which just juggled jobs. Like, they would juggle construction jobs. They would do a bit of work on this job, and then they would say, "Oh, there's too much rain. Someone got COVID, blah blah blah." And at that time, they just run with the other job that pays more. And so it's like, it's one of these things where it's a bit like, you know, one of these blokes who just, like, you know, dates multiple Tinder girls. When they'll date one a few days of the week, jump to the next one, jump to the next one, jump to the next one. It just, that happens with the construction industry here, and it's fucking ridiculous. I don't know. Just because there's all these fucking delays and bureaucratic hurdles that, you know, makes an industry to enforce laws and interpretations of laws in Australia. It's fucking mental. I'll pass it to Jish and what he thinks.
Yeah, Sterny, I wanted to quickly ask you actually on that. Those fire regulation groups, because I think I have an idea of one of them, because I'm a fire warden at work. Is that Hendry? I think they're called Hendry.
Hendrick. How do you spell that?
Hendry. Hendry.
Can you quickly look that up? Let me confirm that for you.
Yeah, because I know some of them, and the guy who comes and does our talks, you know, he's a pretty funny guy, and he's like, "Oh yeah, I just came back from like even Norfolk Island for a nice trip or something, just to give one of these speeches."
Oh, they do that, yeah. Well, there's the fire safety industry is massive.
It seems like it, yeah.
Yeah, no, you've probably just got one type of consultant, one type of company visit your work, and they all give the speech and they get paid to do it, and it's a stable work. Whenever I went to the fire conference last year, 2 years ago with work, and the fire conference is the big conference for fire industry in Australia. And, you know, the first thing they see is, "Oh, you're a graduate. We get to brainwash you now." Some guy selling, you know, some like, you know, non-combustible, you know, plastering equipment, plastering material tried to sell me, or, you know, these automatic fire suppression systems. You know, look at ours. Please write yours in your reports. Recommend it as recommend us as the standard. You know, it's like they're all trying to do that and try to brainwash you, and, you know, tell your boss to write this in the reports. And it's like, I know it sounds pretty insidious, and it kind of is if you're not a smart fire engineer, but it's in these situations where you'll get people trying to recommend their products for you to recommend in the fucking reports. And
I can tie that in as well, like with what Sunshine was asking. So America, like Australia, is a federation. So I'd say it depends on our states. Although I'd probably say the difference between our states aren't as extreme as the ones in America. Like, I know Queensland is considered kind of like our Texas, but the difference between, say, Texas and California is arguably much bigger than, say, Queensland and Victoria, which would probably be our equivalent of Texas and California. So I think, for example, I can only really speak on New South Wales, where me and Stern are from. But I think it's similar in Victoria as well, with how regulation happy they are. And I'm glad you mentioned that as well, because in this case, I've only made a Facebook post on it. Might do a note on Substack about it. But in Darling Harbour, which is like one of the prime tourist locations people go to in Sydney, they've got like this nice waterfront there. It used to have like pretty much like a wooden promenade over the harbour. and it would just go immediately down into the water, kind of thing, like as you'd imagine a promenade to be. Now, apparently, I don't know if it was one person or many people over time, but either way, for that whole frontage had been there since about 1988, which they built there for the bicentenary of, modern Australia was founded in 1788. So it might have been over time, but even so, about 5 years ago, around the time of COVID, they put a fence around the whole site. And it's like a temporary fence as well. But what I mean by temporary is it looks temporary. So it's not even kind of built in nice in that way. And they have all these signs as well there as well, going like, if you jump in the water even, you're going to be fined to shit, pretty much. And I, even had a inside joke with one of my friends, because when we were drunk one night, we were all like in nice suits, for example, on this particular night. And I was like, with one of my, as you could call it, larrikin mates, he was like, "Oi, mate, I dare you to swim in the water and touch one of the water barges for like one of the events and then swim back." And I'm like, "Yeah, sure, $50, that's enough to ruin what little dignity I have left." But yeah, we could have sworn that those fences were there, but I don't remember that the signpost saying you will get fined would be there. But when we went swimming out there anyway, and we went back, we got approached by one of the security guards there going, we called the police, like, you better go now. And we were like, shit. And we just sort of like bolted when we put on everything else. But I'm pretty sure, yeah, those signs for the fines weren't there. But yeah, the main point about the whole regulation thing, yeah, I'd probably say overall, unless it's California, America is a bit more free in that sense, even if I would argue a little too much on the other end of things. Because I don't like the regulations here when, as I was saying on my post, why are we having fences here? Yeah, obviously, like some people do, and they did, like fall off into the water when they were drunk and they drowned. But I'm like, well, by that logic, why don't we fence our entire coastline? Or the ones that are like, visited the most, like, I don't know, put a fence up near, I guess, Watson's Bay or something like that, one of the big tourist areas, and then do the same thing, and then warn people, if you dare swim here, even when you're not drunk, we'll fine you to pieces. It's like something almost like out of Singapore. It's kind of ridiculous. Yeah, and with the Americans sort of the stereotyping us as well, I guess, to be fair, it's similar in annoyance to if we went to America and we were like, chewing on some wheat or something and going like, get the sawn-off shotgun, Delilah or something. I think there's an alien out there or something,
I quite appreciate the accent right there, I must say.
I was going to let Sunshine talk a bit, but I was basically just thinking, like, I mean, look, I've only been to Alaska when I was 3 years old, so I could barely remember it. But I do know Americans here in Australia who've moved here and stuff. And I've got a close friend who's another fire engineer he's in the 70s, but he grew up most of his time in the States and did fire work. And he's had a great life here. And he moved here when he married an Aussie woman. We chat a bit, everything in the US and that sort of thing. And he's very intelligent in that sort of regard. I don't know. I'll pass things on to Sunshine because he obviously we answered your question, or we tried to answer your question or talk about what you wanted. I thought you'd get your response on that, actually.
Yeah, I think that Australia, like when I remember during the pandemic when there was a lot of coverage of the responses in different countries, and I remember telling a friend of mine who's a Korean citizen, but like he grew up partly in America, about Australia. Then he goes like, "Oh, I guess Australia is like what has like Asian values." Which is a term, that used to be used in like the 90s by Lee Kuan Yew and company. But I think there's like a spectrum, right, where I think like the US is, depending on the state, of course, kind of extreme in the sense of like risk appetite that it has, as well as with just the kind of lack of rules and social norms. But I think that there's a continuum where it's like, I don't know, maybe like France and Italy would be like a bit more over, and then I think like the other Anglo-Saxon countries would be a bit more, and then probably like Germany would be more regulated. Korea, they basically surveil everything, so you basically just can't do anything illegal, otherwise you'll get caught. So it's not even due to social rules or anything that people have to follow. It's just like they have CCTVs everywhere. So there's a man who tried stealing some jewelry, and he swapped outfits like 6 times and took 7 different cabs. And the next morning, he got arrested because they have all the surveillance. It's basically how people imagine China. So I think on the continuum, it's like Australia is still probably, like in America, are probably still closer to each other than they are to, like, let's say like Korea or Singapore. I think certainly out on the continuum among Western countries, I think the U.S. is like quite extreme in just its level of tolerance for disorder and rule breaking.
Always loved that about the US, not gonna lie. It's that last bastion of just like people just doing whatever the fuck they want. Well, no, I'm actually, I should actually say, no, Thailand is a bit more like that. Southeast Asia in general, they just, government, at least for tourists and stuff, does not give less of a shit. Bar like Singapore, because that's technically in Southeast Asia, but I don't count in Southeast Asia in my view. You know, like you go, I don't know what the fuck, you know, some of these countries do. Even like places like Serbia and parts of Russia, you know, there's the amount of things people get away with. Like, Jesus, you see those videos out of Russia. People driving fucking tanks, you know, people doing the shots they do, the fucking level of alcohol in a fucking rakia, you know, it's just, I don't understand. It's just countries that are basically just like that, they just let you do whatever the fuck you want within reason, as long as you know, as long as you don't like make fun of a politician sort of thing. It's ridiculous because it's just so disjointed, the whole place. It's not by any means of like live and let live. It's just literally the place is disjointed, so they just let people do what they want because it's too hard to police it all. Just so those specific things are police. It's kind of funny the way they do it. But yeah, I definitely think this. I kind of wish there's some bits of the states that. I mean, there's so much that we don't want from the states, or the politicians everyone tries to push back against the states on. But there's also some things from the states we just need. So it's like I don't know, like I don't know what it is with this willingness to try and regulate fucking everything, you know, like to solve an issue sometimes. So like for example, even if it's like, you know, private regulations and like terms conditions and that sort of thing that you get happening, it's like my grandfather, when he wrote his philosophical tracks I've been publishing posthumously, he wrote one of the most recent one that I published. I noticed one he wrote about 10 years ago, and he wrote that HR departments and PR departments are basically just like set up just to communicate and obliged by government regulations. Now that they're to represent the company, but they're there to use government regulations to their advantage, so that there's this lawfare environment, which if you didn't have all that regulation that you could take advantage of and play asymmetrical battles with employees and stakeholders and, you know, customer complaints to protect yourself with, it would be much more in a freer market, would be held more accountable in some regards, or, you know, there'd be different. There's these things that this legislation, that there's this regulatory capture that HR and PR that they can manipulate legislation and norms around how processes around these things work. That they, you know, it's all just government bureaucracy, manipulation, you know, filtration sort of work. It's not even communicating with government. Sometimes, I mean, we communicate with the Fire Brigade, for example. We submit briefing documents, and then they comment. We back and forth to get, before we start working on the main, you know, building report that helps the developer get their construction certificate, then start moving dirt. In Australia, it's beyond. I don't know what it is. It's just we just do it the way we do. It's actually a fascinating one you got onto with regulation. I even think that I don't like, you know, there's a lot of criticism I offer to Davy Jones, Donald Trump, that sort of thing, even to the extent that, like, what, they're going to, like, kick Norwegian tourists out because they have edited pictures of JD Vance on their phone that practically everyone's already seen. So I don't understand that bit. And there's all these issues, if you might know about it, of leaving up time, and, you know, Riverside doesn't kick us off. Hopefully it'll be okay. I was going to say that, you know, there's these Australians just get detained at the fucking border for like random things now. There's all these reports every single day a week I see on my Instagram. Oh, Australian detained in US border. Australian detained in US border. Australian detained in US border. Well, are you pissed off at the fact that we didn't let Candace Owens in, or we didn't, you know, there's all these people we didn't let in. Like, I know it's like piss stupid that we do this, but why are you continuing this fucking battle? I mean, I mean, it'd be kind of funny if like Donald Trump sued Australia for like not letting Candace Owens in. That'd be funny, but I don't understand why they're trying to do this shit to us when we just go to visit the fucking country. It's ridiculous.
I think there's some news story about like there's a U.S. Marine who was married to an Australian lady, then she got deported. Then there's like some New Zealander who came to California as a tourist, and he got detained by customs and got deported. So it's like it's happening all the time. I think there's also some journalists who got shot by like a rubber bullet by during the like ICE situation in LA. So it's quite chaotic. I kind of get the impression that most Australians view America as kind of like an omen of what to avoid. I don't know. Tell me if that's correct or not. But I know Dan Andrews, when he's running for re-election, was running these ads saying like, "Oh, I don't want to Americanize Victoria, and like we're not going to turn into the U.S." So I get the impression that America is viewed as quite undesirable politically in Australia.
Yeah, it's funny you say that as well, because in my job and all, I remember, well, they weren't really supposed to do this, but it probably doesn't help that there was a case when an ABF officer, so that's Australian Border Force, was fired because they were stupid enough to detain a Bruneian diplomatic attaché, and like basically open their diplomatic bags, which is to anyone else a huge no-no on the international stage, and they got absolutely shafted for doing that. So I think that's why they obviously got fired as well, because that's quite a even international embarrassment. But yeah, also with what Stern was saying last time about our biosecurity, yeah, it might be a little bit extreme in some cases, but I think they have a lot of the biosecurity laws here because we're one of those weird first world countries where we actually make most of our money from primary industry still. So it's like pastoral industries and mining sort of industry. And so particularly with pastoral industries, therefore, if we have more pests come in, it could like absolutely gut the sort of economy there. I mean, this sort of country as well, where with our issues such as rabbits and so there's external pests or internal pests, indigenous pests, dingoes. In this case, we've built like these massive fences. So rabbit-proof fence is one example. I think that's actually like one main fence, and there's like two other parallel fences that go throughout Western Australia. So that's quite well known in the film about the stolen generations, rabbit-proof fence as well, because that's where the indigenous kids running away followed along the fence. We were also infamous for our anti-pest wars and the so-called memed emu war. When we literally took two men with machine guns and started mowing down like whole groups of emus in Western Australia. And we supposedly lost that because we were like, oh, there's too many emus, even with the rounds we're giving. So they just gave up. Or the dingo fence in the east, which is apparently one of the longest fences in the world. So, we have all of this ingrained in our culture to the point that tying that up even with Asia and China, surprisingly, there's a ad that a lot of people growing up in Australia know about. I forgot what the guy's name is, but he's like a famous actor in Australia, for example. And the ad, I don't remember what the ad was about, but he was taking his daughter home, and the daughter's like, "Oh, Dad, what's the Great Wall of China for? What was it built for?" And he's sort of like, to keep the rabbits out. Like obviously that was crap, but it's like shows kind of our surprising culture here of how many, I think they're called pest exclusion fences or something, like how wide they are. I think that's why we have that here. But yeah, also with the spectrum of America versus Asian countries in that sense, I would agree with Sunshine that Australia and Anglo countries are a bit more in that regulated sense of things. And sometimes I think, obviously it depends. It's not always like a bad thing. Like when I went to Singapore, I appreciated how clean, efficient, almost futuristic the city-state was, and it came out of a place that actually had a lot of malarial issues. It had quite a large amount of an infant mortality rate, for example, and all of that. So it's quite impressive in that sense, but it's basically a dictatorship to the point that I remember watching a documentary on that before. Like there was, they have enough bureaucracy there, for example, that Lee Kuan Yew and his party sort of constantly give out trumped up charges to his political opponents, and all they do is basically, apparently they can do that, they spam that constantly. So even if it gets defeated, they're back in court again and again, and they just end up losing their money, these types, and that so-called speaker's corner, which we have one like that as well, but that in theory is like the only bastion of free speech in Singapore. In this documentary, Lee Kuan Yew was even laughing about that, going something along the lines of, haha, nobody bloody uses it. So, who cares, pretty much. That's how, arrogant he was about that, and how it's illegal in Singapore to even make fun of politicians. And his excuse is, why should you be making fun of, I don't know, people governing and looking after the estate anyway? It's almost like a filial piety kind of thing. Like, you shouldn't criticize your elders. Whilst here in Australia, probably similar in America, for a good reason, we treat our politicians like an absolute bloody circus. So yeah, I'll put the...
If you see this week, you can, by the way, you can turn on, policy is, you can turn off your microphone when you want. It's as long as it's the interjecting's not too bad. As long as there wasn't, like the last time we were recording, we had some feedback issues because we're in the same room together, me and Jish, but it's fine now. So just feel free. Just by the way, you don't need to always wait for me to tell you or for pause. But what I was going to say was, just this week, Bob Catter, the very, very famous Bob Catter, he went viral because he'd threatened to punch the mouth of another journalist because they brought up his ethnic background, and his ethnic background is Lebanese. Because he's basically this. You can't make it up. He's this cartoon character. He's like this confused bloke who, up from the far north of Queensland, which is basically just like rural Florida. And it's got all these crocodiles and all this other, banana farms and watermelon farms and all this other shit and, sugar plantations and, it's a history of slavery of the Pacific Islanders and that sort of thing to farm sugar. What is it? But the politician they have there is a guy who's an ex-Nationals politician who happens to have like Lebanese grandparents. God knows how they got there and survived the White Australia policy. God knows how, but he's an old dude, like, acts as Australian as they get, but, he's got darker skin looking than, the rest of the conventional Australian public. So he'll go around, he has this big, long, Middle Eastern looking nose, but he's got this very Australian accent. Hey, what do you mean? No. And he sounds like this, and whenever his background gets brought up, he has to overcompensate for some reason. Like, it's that people like don't realize he's, he doesn't even realize he's doesn't look conventionally white. So he'll just yeah, it's racist, and then despite it gets fucking ridiculous because he spends the entire time acting all Aussie. And then when someone points out, you're not exactly like the most conventional looking Australian, we can't not take the piss out of our politicians because they're just so fucking unhinged half the fucking time. Like, even I'd be inclined to extend that making fun of, if you work in government, you've got to be careful who you make fun of, obviously, but, there's a bit of a thing about in the Australian and, there's other places, we'll always take the piss out of even like some major public servants who get elected. There was the whole issue with the Racial Discrimination Commissioner and the head of the Human Rights Commissioner, Gillian Triggs, and this other dude called Tim Sufomasan, who were like about 10, 15 years ago were having to give the Australian a hard time. They had Bill Leak before he died, was just drawing fucking pictures of Tim Sufomasan as like, Kim Jong-il and stuff like that because he was trying to prosecute people for free speech issues because, they'd offended some people. So it's like there was just stupid shit like that happening. It was really, really funny.
Yeah, Bill Leak is like our Ben Garrison. Yeah,
he's like a Ben Garrison.
In effect, I found that, I got to admit, I can see why it's definitely offensive. I think at the very least, they didn't mute him, and I believe in free speech as well. Well, what he did was definitely Ben Garrison levels of unsubtle. I won't lie, but I had a chuckle at one of his ones, which is still incredibly racist, but I think it was making fun of us, because we used to be a leader in solar panels, like innovation here, and I think we had some sort of deal when we gave our solar panels to India, and Bill Leak drew a cartoon, when these Indian guys were, kind of also squatting on the street as well, because, that's what it almost looks like. And then they're like, oh, what do we do with it? What do we do with this, sir? Almost like that. And it was like, I don't know, but it tastes good with chutney. And he had like the broken piece of solar panel going into the chutney. And I'm going, oh, Jesus Christ. But yeah,
they don't. These cartoonists do not go subtle. It's just like fucking unhinged as fucking shit. It's great. Like I miss that stuff from the US, like the Mad Magazine shit, like the stuff where
Mad
it's like,
Magazine, that was great.
yeah, Mad Magazine, the stuff I grew up with at the news age, and it was like fucking like, no, that's like what Walt Bismarck's all about. Walt Bismarck's all just about this unhinged fucking, hinged on unhinged of unhinged. It's so fucking ridiculous that how can you call it racist? It's racist, but it's so over the top, stupid racist. Look at like, it's just you can't. There's nothing you can say about it other than that fact. It's just fucking stupid.
Oh yeah, well, funny enough, when you're talking about the kind of hate directed towards politicians in Australia, remember I was talking to some Australians before who it was in Vietnam. Then I mentioned I'd met Kevin Rudd. Then they just told me, they go, hey, we call him Kevin Dad. I was like, oh, they really don't hold like prime ministers in esteem.
No, Kevin Rudd, my uncle and auntie, who are a bit more on the extreme side of their politics, I'm pretty sure they went to that bloody rally today, and I don't want to know what they did and what they said. They're kind of like those kinds of people. They're both Jewish, but they are like a little on the extreme side. I've posted about them before on my Substack. I can send you personal details, about their YouTube channel they have and stuff. Of my uncle's got a mannequin of George Soros, and he starts singing it, a parody song of this Genghis Khan, saying that he sold Jews out to the Nazis and stuff like that. And at the end of the video, he starts beating the mannequin up with a baseball bat.
I saw that one. That was hilarious.
Yeah, it's so fucking funny, but it's so fucking stupid. And he's like, he wanted it to go viral, and he didn't even go viral. But well, maybe it could go viral after this podcast is released. I don't fucking know. But what I was going to say with this regard is like, yeah, back in about 10, 20 years ago, they just used to call him Crud. So, because it was like his initials are Kevin Rudd, so just Crud, and they just say, "Oh, Crud," and it's just like they would call him Crud because it's just like there was a lot of these things where some people think that he'd only won because of the Kevin '07 shirts. Now, I think that's a little bit cynical because John Howard was not exactly the most popular guy either. He was a crusty old fucker who had these big bushy eyebrows, and just by the time he was trying to reel in like more ways to dismantle the unions and workplace protections, people just had enough of him. And I can think of no other reason why people didn't want to just get this fresh new face, even if it was just this dude who looked like a used car salesman walking around with his name on the shirt.
Then we literally have Scotty from marketing soon after, so that's what I mean about these types.
Fucking worse and worse and worse. Yeah, the Scott Morrison, that mentioned on Walt Disney podcast. Yeah, ScoMo, it just got worse and worse and worse and worse. Like this scammy Australian parody of itself, sort of like culture in our politics. It just got worse and worse and worse. And I think, to be honest, the reason people voted in Albo is because he just seemed like, even though there wasn't like much to talk about, he was just the most normal person on the fucking field. Like, it's like, yeah, there's this lispy old guy with an Italian last name that means Albanian in Italian. Albanese means Albanian. So it's like, so this guy with the last name Albanian is, with a lispy voice, mild-mannered dude seemed more reputable than like some guy who just appropriated multiple ministries, delayed the vaccine rollout, was in bloody Hawaii when the bushfires started. Like, it's just this showman who was constantly caught with his pants down, and I don't understand. His own electorate would keep voting him in because they thought, oh, yeah, he's the guy who goes to go watch the Sharkies in Cronulla and they entered the NRL. And just, he's so positive. He goes to the local church, mate. He goes to the local, it's down in the Sutherland Shire. They're not all that stupid. Yeah, no, he has the Hillsong Church. I had a mate, I won't mention his name, but I had a mate at the time tell me, "Oh yeah, bro, I just actually took a piss on Scott Morrison's church once." Like, he actually took it straight in, and I'm like, "What the fuck? Were you drunk?" And he goes, "No, bro, broad daylight." I'm like, "Okay, did anyone catch you?" "No." I'm like, "Okay." Like, yeah, there's he has a bit of a Greek Italian sort of like Aussie voice, the Woggy voice, if you want to call it that. So he does all this stupid shit. This mate I've had. He's done a lot of this stupid shit, and it's like entertaining to hear him talk about it too. But it's like at the same time, it's like, okay, taking a piss on Scott Morrison's church, like, okay, sure, great. Well, I don't know why you would want to do that, but he did. Well, I didn't see him do it, but he told me he did. I'm like, okay.
For Sunshine, though, Hillsong is like technically what Christian nationalism is in America. Like, it's basically Protestant.
Pentecost.
Yeah, Pentecostal. It's very much like big business sort of stuff there overall, let's face it. Like, even, well, arguably in my point of view, being more irreligious, I think there's a bit of a business side on most religions, but this is especially so. This is like a televangelist kind of stuff.
I think that they've expanded to France now, interestingly, of all places. They have they set up a church there. But I remember my dad flew to Australia, he told me, when it was like a little before I was born. Then he said that there are a bunch of Korean missionaries like on the plane. So he asked an Australian guy, like, why are they like sending missionaries to Australia? And the guy told him, like, most people are not religious. Yeah, I guess that's why it's kind of weird, I guess, that you guys had a guy who belonged to that as a prime minister, just given the secularism.
Yeah, well, it's because he's a snake. He was in a marketing department, and then he got into, this corporate sort of, happy washing language that he was just a master of doing. He looked at that daggy dad persona he put on was like all just marketing, and everyone ended up calling him Scotty from marketing because he was like literally used to work in the marketing department, and so he was just always doing marketing, but no action, and it got worse and worse and worse and worse and worse, and COVID just made it 5 times as worse. Like, in terms of like what the fucking shit that he tried pulling, the fast ones he tried pulling. He was. I don't understand how they let him get as far as he fucking did, and I don't know. It's just they don't exactly. The current Liberal Party leadership isn't really much to speak of either. They just picked the most random woman they could, and they said, "Oh well, we didn't have enough women. Here's a woman," and it's basically just like. And it's like, that's exactly it. I mean, as I say, as like someone who's affiliated with major parties, like, low-level branch member, like, I will happily say, for the sake of this, on this platform, the podcast, but like, my own opinion to my own, that kind of thing, doesn't reflect anyone else. They just picked one random, here's random woman, front bencher, just, you do it, your job. And it's like, I don't know how long she's going to fucking stay there, because she doesn't inspire a lot of confidence in a lot of people. I was like, as soon as the election ended, there's all these people campaigning, and then, the Liberal Party lost, and then they're like, I'm not renewing a membership this year. I did not find any, inspiration in Susan Lee. I'm just not renewing. And I'm like, Jesus, there's exodus of fucking people from the party. Like, the party probably would have lost a fair bit of money, right? Just people not want to renew their membership. Makes sense, but like, total fucking exodus. I wouldn't be surprised if the whole fucking party implodes at one point. There was a point at which the Nationals, if you follow much of our politics, as I'm impressed you do, Sunshine, there was a point at which the Nationals, for a split second, under David Littleproud, decided just to pull out of the entire coalition agreement entirely, and said they wouldn't renew it because the Liberals under Susan Lee had taken on this upper North Shore, eastern suburbs, privileged, hyper-bourgeois teal vote tactic. The teal vote is this, it's basically just like, the politics of like kind of Hollywood almost. There's just rich people who basically want electric cars everywhere, and rich people who want no taxes on all their investment properties, but more taxes on like, things like mining and, and coal and stuff like that. So it's like stuff which only benefits them, and then they think that they're God's gift in society, sort of politics, and it's cancerous. And she tried getting these votes back by trying to say, oh yeah, we'll ban nuclear, despite the fact Dutton was proposing to unban nuclear. So then David Littleproud's like, fucking no. And then they didn't want to provide, and then Nationals is also about the farmers and the heavy industry, and then they wanted to do more regulations on farms and industry, and they want to cut these subsidies to farms, and David Littleproud's like, fuck no. And he pulls out, and we're all like, yes, keep doing it. And then, no, next week, oh yeah, we're back in the coalition again. Come on.
It's like a toxic, like, relationship thing. It was kind of funny. It's like 1 minute they're together. It's like, no, we're definitely not getting back. And then, it was literally only 5 days or something. They're like, no, we're good. We're back together. It's like a divorce waiting to happen.
It's a nuke ready to go off. I mean, there's a problem with all these coalition sort of situations in like Europe. They can't they currently, I read a headline, they can't even make a stable government in France. Like, they're trying to consider like getting the next president or whatever. Like, they've had election after election after election. I don't even know the fucking president. I know Macron's the leader still somehow. I thought Mélenchon had won after beating Le Pen in the finals. But no, they just had another election. Macron won again. I'm like,
I think it's because they
Yes.
got like the weird hybrid system because they have the president like who's elected separately, but then they also have a prime minister and a parliament in addition to the president. So it's like it
Yeah, they do.
does not compute for me.
They have the same in Italy. They basically have a president who has no power. The prime minister has all the power. The president is like purely ceremonial. It's the equivalent of like having a constitutional monarch, but who's elected in, and God knows what the president does. I don't know what the fucking president would do in Italy.
I think in France it's like flipped, where I think the president has a lot of power. Yeah, like in France, the president can like do a lot more than the U.S. president domestically, whereas I think the prime minister is more like the vice, is like a VP.
Okay. So the prime minister is the president.
President Macron, prime minister. They went through like several.
Prime minister. Interesting. Okay. I think the prime minister was having some grief in France, according to the Economist headline. But I don't know. I just look at the situation of France, and I look at Italy and under Meloni, and I follow a bit of that stuff. And here she is promising to do what we did and get hard on the borders and do what Abbott did and just hard no to all boats. God knows why they haven't fucking implemented it in Europe. I tried even asking ChatGPT, and apparently it's because it's you have to go through multiple countries to finally meet Australia, and then like there's that the Torres Strait's quite a long strip distance. So if you do what Abbott did, which is get the Navy to intercept the boat, then give them out a fiberglass boat with just enough fuel to get back to Indonesia, that's a perfectly viable strategy. But the Mediterranean and like the English Channel, I guess when you're halfway, you're halfway to the place. But so if you gave them like something with half a thing of petrol, you'd have to be or diesel to get back to the shore, where they originally departed. You'd have to be intercepting them like well within the waters of that other country. So you'd have to be going in the English, if they wanted to implement Abbott's strategy, would have to probably patrolling the French waters and then intercept the boats and then like give them a boat with enough petrol to get back to France, but not England. And that would be difficult because there's people who even swim the English Channel. So it's that's a hard one. That'd have to be some bilateral agreement with France. And then when the situation with Italy occurred, Greece, there's all these people rocking up in like Lesbos and bloody Lampedusa, where the local population can't even support the amount of people that have just overrun the place. Well, guess what they could do is they tried to implement these, a system where they could try and return them to, another country in North Africa to, be safely returned, like in the case where we're sending it back to Indonesia. But it's the reason that they're not bound by, we've got more independence than they do. And it's seen as like a massive bilateral issue not to let the boats in because we're not signed up to some, dog shit, crazy, European human rights law, which just, was drafted after World War II to, prevent like Jews getting gassed. And, but then like, and not being forced to accept Jews who are running away from, occupying powers. But it went from like supporting other European states, but manage their wars and manage their minorities that are getting persecuted, and it all was located within the European continent. To let's just fucking accept everyone, and it's just gotten to the stage where all these human traffickers have like this perfect incentive system where they'll be like, okay, just get them on the fucking mule train. Here's your boat. I'll take your life savings and your passport. You get out on this boat, and they're forced to accept you, and then they're in limbo, and it's like they can't be sent back because whenever you try to, they tried the Rwanda plan in England, and they tried all these other plans which to send them back to another country, and it got to the stage where because they had this stupid European Human Rights Commission thing, which is like it's like you're basically shooting yourself in the foot by implementing half this shit because when Australia we just don't fucking have it, and I know we have this massive crackdown on these things, but in my personal view, like Japan does this stuff. Korea does this stuff. They're tough on what they do. Like, there's all these countries that are not in the West that are so tough on like their situation with who they bring in and who they let out, and the developed countries. I don't understand why with this idea if the West needs to set the example of not being racist. It's like, sure, okay, it's good to get over this racist past and stuff, but at the same point, countries that aren't even white or Anglo-Saxon or European or whatever are doing this stuff. No one bats a fucking eyelid. Even people in the Middle East are doing this stuff, and they seem to just the left and the progressive sort of media doesn't really let them. That doesn't really kind of lets them off the hook because they're too busy focusing on the times when Italy tries to make a plan to regulate what's going on, or England tries to make a plan to regulate what's going on. It's like suddenly like they've murdered they've it's like they're suddenly like they're acting like Saudi Arabia or something, even though they're not. So it's just I don't know.
Yeah, you'd be surprised if you go to Japan nowadays. Whenever you go to a convenience store, you pretty much don't see Japanese people working in it. You basically see Indians, Nepalese, Vietnamese people. If you go to Tokyo, at least, like it's like filled with immigrants now. The rest of the country maybe not, but when I've been to Tokyo, it's like so many people from like the Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia, and like the Middle East nowadays. It's quite surprising.
I'll pass it to Jish because he's probably got some interesting stuff to say about this matter. He's probably got his own opinions on the matter because him and I, obviously, we've had our fun discussions on Facebook about this stuff. Because we personally know each other about I've had my own issues with the way some of these activists and stuff have been against. I don't know. I've talked with him about this case, this really standout case. We're talking on Facebook, we're having a bit of back and forth, and it was he raised some very interesting points to me. I had this freak out moment where I found out that we had this Rohingyan pedophile who'd been in one of our onshore detention facilities, and he was going to get in Burma. They have the death penalty, and so they were going to hang the bloke because he'd been convicted of touching an 8-year-old, but then he knew that he'd been persecuted, so he was on a refugee boat, and they finally detained him in Victoria. And then suddenly out of nowhere, some Sydney-based chambers, I forget their name, ends up taking uses him as a client. They give him a blank name, like a code name, so people wouldn't want to go out and murder him themselves because it's that high-profile shit. And there's people who probably want to do that. It's that's why it's that sensitive. So they put him up there, and it was the XCB whatever case, and he got let off. He get the ruling that from the which is like your Supreme Court. Is this guy can't be returned under international human rights law to his original country because he will face the death penalty. Therefore, he will be kept here, and therefore anyone within onshore detention can't be kept in onshore detention because of this case. And then they suddenly had to let these people go. And I just thought, is that how it just works? Geez. I mean, you can say what you want. Try and say what you want, Jish, because obviously I'm just kind of rattling off my opinion, and I'm being very, very biased to, I guess, my own personal issues with some of these things, so I'll just keep it at that.
No worries. Yeah, again, it's these are my opinion, and these are my opinions, and they're not a reflection of our government or the Department of Home Affairs. No, I'd say I think the problem in the EU, for example, was how loose the rules are in the Schengen area, which is fine internally, but because a lot of these immigrants were coming through, the edge of that bubble, once they come inside, it's quite hard to either move them on. If they are moved on, they go to sort of different countries within the Schengen area. And it was especially with the Syrian civil war, which was an unprecedented amount of a refugee wave. I think I remember hearing about that. It was the largest migration wave since the end of World War II. It might have even been bigger. So obviously, that's definitely an issue. And I hear now that they're trying to see if they can move them back to Syria now, which is probably what they'll have to do eventually. I think it made it worse that a lot of the Eastern European countries that are part of the EU, like Hungary and Poland as well, absolutely refused to let most of these migrants in. For the crisis that it was, though, and being part of the EU, they should have all taken a similar sort of load. Otherwise, it's kind of unfair because France is taking a huge amount of the migrants, and then Hungary and Poland were hardly taking in anything. And they get most of the monetary handouts and the sort of, all the good shit from the EU. I think the same, we're probably lucky in Australia, a bit like Britain as well, that we're an island country, so it's a lot harder for people smugglers and all that to come to Australia. So I obviously get the logic here, for example, that we can't just let everyone in. And I do understand the need for offshore processing. I think, though, it was terrible that we, on Manus, Nauru, and I think previously before then, Christmas Island. No, but actually I think it was worse than Manus and Nauru, though, because they're international, not just an
Yeah, and
overseas
they
territory.
made most of their these small island nations in the Asia Pacific area, which just literally had most of their economy's GDP based on these prisons we were paying them to run.
But yeah, but there were like all these human rights violations there and everything, and our government responded by putting up a media ban. Like it's like
Well, they put in a media ban. Yeah,
it's just disgusting and all, and you can't really do that. So it's like I understand the whether you call it unfortunate or not need for offshore detention processing, but I think at the very least we need to make it transparent, and we need to make sure that we're fulfilling our end of the human rights deals. Yeah, same with the whole Rohingya guy, because we can't just ship him back to his death, because if he's considered a refugee and we're part of the refugee accord, then we have a responsibility not to chuck him back to a country that will kill him.
Yeah, but that's kind of like how this legal entanglement sort of, when you sign up to these agreements, sort of it kind of all processes and ends up. I mean, I understand the human rights stuff is really, really, really important. And look, I will just say, like, if this is purely my own sort of observations on the matter, it doesn't reflect anyone I work for or anyone any committees I'm associated with, anything like that. It's just purely my own observations. So that's just it's just what I'm airing for the sake of the discussion. But yeah, I guess the reason I got to this stage where even my grandpa was writing stuff like about these agreements and stuff we sign up to internationally. I think that I don't know. It's just that there's all these countries that you talk about, Poland and Hungary and these the Czech Republic to some extent, just being absolute bloody bricks in the water, just not moving, not fucking budging. And I completely understand, like, what you're talking about. The issue, and then what they were trying to argue at that point, was that they'd also been, there's the lyric by the one Rome I saw last night, and he made the song "Who Only Europe You Know," and "Who Only Europe Know" opens up with, it's a play on, like, it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek piss take on, like, Enoch Powell's old speech, and it's basically saying, well, what's gonna, there's all these poor, sick and tired people. No one has the heart to bring him in, and what's going to happen next? And it's like, and what I think is in this regard was, there's one lyric that goes, we weren't asked, brother, no, we were told. And the idea was, in the view of Eastern Europe, they were never asked, they were told. And so obviously there's this expectation that if they're receiving EU funds, which they consume a lot of, they should be playing ball. But then there's another argument which says, well, who's setting the agenda? If it's just France, Netherlands, and Germany who dominate the European Parliament and Commission in their influence, then that means they are setting the games, and whenever they decide to open the gates and everyone else has to pay the price, then they're basically telling everyone else they have a new situation to deal with that they'd never asked for. And so I guess that's the reason they were being so difficult, in my opinion, because they were forced into a situation where, I know, like the Syrian civil war, they kind of just showed up.
So they have equal representation, though, like probably an equal amount of seats.
Yeah, but it's they sure might have an equal amount of seats, but the amount of, like, buying power and leverage with money that these places that have net input into the coffers of the EU. It's kind of like the IMF. That if you have the US pays most of the fees, they might have a certain amount of seats, but they also have leveraging power. So they'll be like, well, you won't receive this if you don't comply. You won't receive that if you don't comply.
Isn't that the same with Trump, though, and NATO? As much as I don't particularly like Trump, I mean, he has a little bit of a point to go, why is the rest of NATO complaining when we put a lot of our money?
I'm not gonna lie. It's a very interesting situation in that regard. Like, Trump's put himself into. Like, I will completely see. Right. Like, traditionally the Americans, and Sunshine can say something more about willingness along these lines. I'll pass it to him in a second, but I'll say this: the Americans, we've been talking in economics class, we're in like year 11, 12. Oh, the IMF Americans put in all this money to these international organizations, and they could make the argument that these organizations are actually very US biased with all the money that they put in and all the leverage they can do, all these things out. Trump, in some regards, has shattered this because he's like, you know what? Everyone has an equal share. And if you didn't realize it was Donald Trump, you'd think he'd be like some democratic, some statesman for democracy. And I was thinking, like, it's like if you were framing it in that regard, like, you just suddenly realize that he's taken away all this soft power expansion that the US has done over the last 80 years since World War II. And he's just been shattering it. And it's like in his isolationist tactics, he's been like shattering this 80 years of soft power development. And there's some people, even on the left, who are just clapping him for doing it. And it's like, just because they just fucking hate America that much. It's very interesting.
I do agree with Trump's criticism of U.S. allies in the sense that, depending on the country, of course, so it varies country to country, but with most of NATO, they basically give token contributions, if anything, to U.S. foreign policy. So if we just look at Afghanistan, it's like under NATO's Article 5 of its charter, an attack on one's an attack on all, right? But then Afghanistan, the rest of NATO's population is like over 400 million people. The U.S. is like 300 million. And then the U.S. took twice as many casualties in Afghanistan as the rest of NATO, even though it's supposed to be an attack on all. And then within Afghanistan, all the occupation zones are operationally under the U.S. And like the NATO allies will just send tiny forces that are guarded by U.S. forces. And that's why their casualties are so low, and they rely on U.S. logistics to even deploy there. And they basically are only there for just diplomatic show and not for material contributions. I think there are some exceptions. So, for example, in the Iraq War, the Britain sent like 46,000 soldiers for the invasion, which relative to the size of their army is substantial. But and also in Afghanistan, Britain took almost as many casualties per capita as the U.S. But like most of these NATO countries are just kind of they're either not really contributing, or they'll contribute a token force for diplomatic purposes, but there's no material benefit on the ground to the U.S. from it. The last war, I think, where U.S. allies were actually operationally significant on their own was probably the Vietnam War, where like Korea and Australia both had pretty substantial forces and they had their own operational zones instead of just being within areas under U.S. control. So I think there is a valid critique, and it's like this might be the only way to incentivize the countries to start picking up the slack, particularly just given the GDP balance between the US and China and how that will affect the military balance as time passes. It's like I don't think the US will have the resource capacity to basically be the primary deterrent in several regions at once. Instead, I think most of its power would have to just be concentrated in the Indo-Pacific region, and that I think Europe will have to basically be able to defend itself independently, which should not be that difficult because Russia is not that significant economically or demographically. So I think that as sloppily as his rhetoric can be, and as much damage as he does to America's image, it's like in terms of the material balance, I think that this is a direction that's necessary to move towards. When it comes to sort of international organizations like the World Bank and IMF, it's one of those things where it's like these were created more to help countries integrate into the liberal order, but I think So people are more liberal internationalists will see that as fundamentally in U.S. interests, especially if the U.S. is seen as the leader of this particular order. But I think that people have more realist or nationalistic view of international relations will see it as not being in the direct benefit of the participant countries, at least as far as security goes. Whether or not that's the case is, of course, up to debate and depends on one's priors. But I think that is kind of an attitude Republicans have traditionally had. It's just that most of them wouldn't go as far as actually taking this big of a leap as Trump has. But yeah, I think that the big damage Trump has done is in terms of America's image and the unnecessary instigation towards countries like talking about annexing Canada, which gets to very deep insecurities, or like talking about seizing Greenland from Denmark, etc. So like the image damage is very real. I think though in terms of the material demands he's made, those I think are legitimate.
Yeah, that's fair. Kind of, I do find that interesting though when you said America is shifting towards the Indo-Pacific, because I think even a sense though Trump isn't doing much of that either, because at the very least he's kind of doesn't comment on Taiwan. I mean, for some reason Biden did, but Biden was off his rocker or something. And when they interviewed him, I remember it's like, if Taiwan gets attacked, would you get involved? And he's sort of like, in this sort of way, like, yes. And that's about it. And apparently, like, the intelligence agencies and stuff were going like, no, come back. And they kept on having to go, no, the president is confused or something like that. But I think with Taiwan, though, which I also found funny with the legal stuff, same with Australia, we recognize the People's Republic over Taiwan, in which there really isn't a choice, with the exception of Bhutan, which apparently doesn't recognize either. But yeah, with Taiwan, it's that I think America has the same legal standpoint when I've heard it said before that do you recognize Taiwan's independence? And the answer is yesn't, because it's like we specifically write it down legally as, how do we write it down? Yeah, that's right. We recognize China's observation that Taiwan is part of China. But nowhere there in that legalese does it say, therefore, Taiwan is China. It's like kind of a roundabout way. And China sort of knows that as well. But it's like kind of that diplomatic tightrope. But when push comes to shove, Trump absolutely should get involved in Taiwan. Because they're even told by some voters there, which, knowing Americans' terrible geography and all, if Taiwan gets affected, essentially overseas parts of America will be right on the doorstep of China by that point with Guam. They can't ignore that. The containment as well would be broken with China. So Taiwan is an incredibly important linchpin there, arguably, and I don't think Trump is doing much about that either.
That's completely true. I'll just quickly interject as an engineer, flex my tech shit here. I was doing an internship at a robotics company, and we're one of these companies which did advanced manufacturing. There's all these government incentives to try and diversify the Australian economy, and one of them is incentives for advanced manufacturing. And I was working in one of these joints that builds robotics for underwater drones, so ROV parts, and extreme pressure testing and stuff like that. Anyway, during this time at the internship, just after COVID, I spent a lot of the internship online, just doing designs, talking with people. Wasn't allowed to go to the main site because even though it was an essential industry, I wasn't listed as one of the essential workers on the production line, so I was all doing it online. Not being paid to do it either, but I was just doing it because I wanted to press, and didn't get a job at the end of it either, but it was still a good experience. But nevertheless, I remember my colleague who's now working at another place, a French dude, another engineer, and he's like, bloody fucking silicon shortage. And it was just it was this idea that because of the fact that there'd been all these backlogs for silicon chips and semiconductors that were coming out of Taiwan and China, and then they just shut these places down because of the COVID lockdowns. These production lines were just constantly being disrupted. And then guess what chews up most of the who pays top dollar for this shortage? It was like Musk and all these other people, from what I remember, in their electric vehicles. They were just going to chuck all these semiconductors and silicon chips into these electric vehicles, from what I remember. And when the electric vehicle market was booming, all the places like ours couldn't get access to semiconductors and silicon chips as easy. So it was just getting to the stage where other key industries were just being eaten up by these whales. And I don't know if the Taiwan goes, these key industries which use electronics in this modern day and age are in deep fucking shit. And that's why we're fucking scared about these kinds of situations, because these chips, unless we started making them here, all iPhones tend to go through Taiwan. All the bloody anything involving semiconductors goes through Taiwan. So we're fucking scared as in the technological.
Yeah, I think Trump himself, I don't think really cares about Taiwan or wider international security. I think his only two foreign policy concerns are how big countries look on maps, hence his interest in Canada and Greenland and Panama, and then trade balances. I know that within his administration, the current Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Elbridge Colby, is highly interested in Taiwan, but I think he can only pivot the admin so much. Therefore, I don't think the Trump administration is going to really move the needle much on the issue, but I think it's just as time passes, right? The U.S. is, if it pursues a rationally self-interested foreign policy, will have to, by necessity, orient its military policy around the Indo-Pacific region, and it won't really have much of a choice. The problem is it might not follow such a rational policy just because of the interest groups involved in foreign policy making, whether it be like, for example, the U.S. Army would lose a lot if the Indo-Pacific became the center of security, because the Army doesn't have much of a role in that region of the world, whereas it does in Europe and the Middle East. Likewise, sectors of like the Pentagon and the State Department that are focused on other regions would just, be out of the jobs. So it's like there are a lot of factors that could prohibit this from happening. I have a bell ringing, so
that's all right. Just off you go.
That kind of reminds you actually of what Sunshine said. I might just repeat this when he comes back, I guess. But yeah, that sounds almost like in World War II, the Europe First policy, ironically. It seems like the same sort of thing, like you were saying, that they're focusing more on the Middle East and Europe in terms of the diplomacy and the politics, and sort of kind of letting Asia go off on its own. But yeah, like I was saying before, I think especially if Trump's definitely taking more of a nativist approach, of course, but if he's taking that seriously, then in terms of the overseas territories, even though, Sunshine's absolutely correct that I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of the American population wouldn't even know what Guam is compared to just, say, Greenland, especially Canada, Panama, etc. But, like I said, with Taiwan gone, if it did go down that path, then containment would have failed with China around the seas, and Guam and towards the Northern Marianas would be absolutely open to Chinese influence. It may as well be like World War II Japan all over again in that sense.
And then we got these, these trade deals which Albo's been setting up. Now, look, I've been contested on this opinion, and I'm happy to stand contested for the opinion that I originally had on this, but I was originally quite taken aback by the fact that China was being engaged to now buy all our steel again. And I don't know, with this hawkish China, if it's been China 10 years ago, I would have been saying yes. But the China now, if it was so hawkish, it's just a repeat of the old United Australia Party selling scrap iron to the Japanese to build warships. I know that people try to say it's a completely different situation, but I see how hawkish she is. It does not look that different. I'm sorry, but that this does give me the chills.
Yeah, no dispute here. I entirely agree. I think Australia is just kind of, I don't know. I feel like Australia will definitely only ever be a middle power, but come on, like we're kind of, I feel like Australia, since, as independent as we've ever been in federation, has kind of been pretty bloody stupid with its foreign affairs. It's always been like almost get too close with Britain. But then, in the end, all our hard work meant for nothing after the fall of Singapore and Japan came on the board. Now it was America, but I would argue, Trump's kind of shat on us, with, remember when he called Malcolm Turnbull Trundle, for example? Just utter forms of disrespect.
Trundle
like
bed, sleep on you. Yeah. I don't care about you.
But yeah, with China, therefore, it's like in terms of economic policy, we've become way too reliant on China. And, I think we should stop doing it. We should diversify a lot more.
We do. And that's what the universities have been doing. I went to an event at my professional society, Engineers Australia, just this last week. And they were doing some of my old lecturers were there. I won't name them for anonymity's sake, but they were giving a speech on AI and education, and I was just saying, talking with one of them, and they said, look, at the uni, we're kind of diversifying. We're sending out, we're looking for new markets. We saw how it happened with China and how disrupted things became when COVID locked down and all this other stuff, and diplomatic relations and all this other stuff. They're now looking to diversify to Southeast Asia and South Asia. So, and then I raised the question, why don't you just look to the States or South America? Why couldn't we try and sell there? Because there's so many South Americans who want to come to Australia. And obviously the implicit bit at the bottom I was also thinking of there's so much similar history we have, and God, I just wish more of them. Oh God, I wish we just had more of them instead of having to deal with a lot of other parts of Asia that, are very so ethno-linguistically isolationist that we do in Australia, but that's just my own personal opinion. So I get along well with South Americans and I can speak Spanish, so that's my bias. But what I was trying to say here was he said, but no, it's true. It's like the thing is, South America has got one of the highest plane ticket flight costs to Australia than anywhere else in the world. You can fly to, you can fly to Europe for cheaper than it costs to go to Chile. I would say you have to, cheaper to go through the United States or LA down to South America than it is to straight to South America because, it's a bombshell and it's not popular enough due to the the massive ocean between Australia and South America, despite it being in the same hemisphere. I don't know. I was thinking about that, but they're all diversifying to, uh, to get to South Asia and Southeast Asia. Now, Southeast Asia, I'm thinking like, well, we've done all this diplomatic, soft power work, in Vietnam and Thailand. We've got a good relationship with some of these countries, and so I wouldn't mind having like more Thai and like more Vietnamese and Koreans and Japanese all coming along. But it's good that they're diversifying, the market, because they realized how unreliable China's been as a partner. So I'm very happy with that, hearing that. But then South Asia, it's like, I don't know why everyone thinks that like the population, this is my personal vision, but I don't know why, because there's like 1.4 billion or how many people in India, and it's such a vastly unequal country and all this other stuff. They think they're just right for like, and they get all these, these educational degrees, half of which, there's all these, if you look into this stuff, there's this guy called the Cyberpunk Dingo who did a thing on like the fake educational degrees and, visa scams that you get in Australia. Typically, I won't point out nationalities that do this fraud, but like we're talking about India here, like big country, they've known to go through these colleges. China was doing it, Southeast Asia doing it. Obviously, all these countries do it to some extent, so I can't just point them out because that's just like, it's not fair if I did that. But what I'm saying is we've got these rorting systems to come live in Australia for an extended period, and it just becomes a bit of a joke because I don't know what the world sees in having this massive country, with like, possibly with a large amount of degree fraud and stuff like that. And just, being able-bodied just to fly over and do some work for you, and then they, I don't know. It's basically, you might as well. It's like we just had like a Smurfs just crash into the earth, and there's like a million Smurfs, and then they're like minions out of bloody Despicable Me, just yabbering and jabbering, and they'll just do work for you. I'm joking a bit, and I shouldn't be depicting Indians like that because it's not nice. You know what I mean? It's just it's as if there's this giant country full of people yabbering and jabbering, because the rest of the world. Now I'm just sounding kind of. What I'm trying to say here is like there's this country with a large excess population, which is largely unemployed. So a lot of India is very unemployed, and they'll just go everywhere else, and it's like remittances everywhere, remittance, and it's just I don't understand what the rest of the world is like feeling like can get out of this apart from the labor. It's like, again, minions out of Despicable Me. It couldn't be minions; it could just be aliens, just who want to do free work.
I think you'd be happy though, because surprisingly under Labour, who you'd usually not expect to have that kind of policy change, but I guess pressure over time, they've got rid of that sort of visa policy that was enacted by the Liberals, which was get a lot more temporary visas, the fact that the so-called administrative review tribunal, which is, it got replaced by the administrative review tribunal. It was called AAT before then. That was known to be quite nepotistic under Abbott. They got paid a lot to do like hardly any work. And the system was like some migrants would come into Australia and then almost on purpose go under review, which was easy because they could stay in the country for a lot longer. All the migration agents knew about hopping over different visas, that it became known as visa shopping. They've cracked down on that a lot now as well, which is also interesting you said about the student visas, because a lot of agents had been caught out using student visas, particularly from Asia, under sort of falsified kind of degrees, and also they could work as sex workers here.
Jesus fucking Christ.
Yeah.
That and like the baby formula shit. There's an article I read in the ABC and SBS about these baby formula mules from China who would just take up a degree as a student, and then on the side would just hustle all these bloody baby formula shit, to send back to China. God, I don't know, like there was a baby formula scandal when there was like arsenic in the baby formula or something. Sunshine would know more about this based on his studies, but I have no fucking clue why they're so fucking obsessed with baby formula like 20 years on. I don't fucking understand.
Regulations.
Yeah, you go. Sunshine. Sunshine, I thought you'd ask and then just you go.
Should I go or Sunshine?
Sunshine.
Yeah, sorry, I was just I had to run down to pick up a delivery. Yeah, I think the benefit that you guys have down under though is you have water, so you can basically just select the people you want to bring in. I think in America, the issue is like a lot of people just fly to whichever country has visa-free entry for their nationality, and then like have people smugglers take them through the land border. So I think it's create a real problem, of course, which contribute to the election results. So I think Australia, it's ultimately a choice if you do something that's undesirable.
Sorry, I'll just pull you up quickly there on that one. What do you mean by a choice if someone's undesirable?
Basically, I mean, like, if your immigration policy is poorly managed, like if you have people coming in to fake universities and getting like fraudulent degrees and becoming Uber drivers and having like 6 roommates, I think it's ultimately the government is just choosing to allow it to happen. It's like if they just change the rules.
Yeah. Okay. No, you're 100% right there. You're 100% right. There's this complacency. Personally, say, look, and again, it doesn't represent anyone I work for, any government agency. In fact, like there's probably a lot of people working for these government agencies on the down low who don't want this happening. But it's just this. There's a complacency culture we have in Australia, just kicking the can down the road, kicking the can down the road, kicking the can down the road, and picked up by someone else. And it's I don't know if. They're finally clamping down on this through Labor, so I'm very happy with that. But the thing is, it's like there's all these fucking protests outside Albo's office when I used to live near there about, Iranians and, Indians and Nepalese who getting pissed off that their visas were getting cut, student visas were getting cut. I'm thinking, well, they're cracking down on it because they're fraudulent. They went to, they didn't get proper degrees. How are we protesting about this if you knew you might have not been eligible in a completely transparent and robust system? Like they're tying up loopholes, and look, you're lucky to make it through, but just take what you won and leave. It's like trying to gamble, just trying to argue with a casino. You've made your chips, go. And that's my opinion on the matter, but it's purely my opinion.
Yeah, I don't think the government though consciously obviously turns a blind eye on this or anything like that. I'm obviously only telling you guys stuff I think is public knowledge anyway, because well, it's not like I have, I don't get to see that much, hidden stuff or whatever. Yeah, so the Labor government, like I was saying anyway, is clamping down on a lot of that now, and that's why they changed the main temporary skill shortage visa, which was, called temporary skill shortage, TSS, into skills and demand. And they're overall, they keep on talking about making Australia one of the best sort of immigration systems in the world, whatever that means. I would kind of dispute that at the moment, but maybe, they're trying to massively overhaul that. But they're definitely moving more towards more permanent kind of visas rather than temporary ones. So even the ones when they traditionally had more temporary skill shortage holders, they are now getting them in to try to get them in the more permanent stream. But yeah, the good news is as well is that the visas, those visas are a little bit more stringent than they were previously. Like English level has gone higher, and there's 2 different types of skill types in the skills and demand ones. From what I know, something like core skills, and I forgot what the other skills is called, but yeah, core skills are obviously the ones that prioritize the most. So probably various types of doctors, technical things, and then all the other jobs would go under that. So yeah, they're really trying to gear up more for a kind of permanent economy in that sense.
That's good to hear. Sunshine, what do you think? I know you were talking a bit about moving to Japan, and I've always been impressed by some of the guests that Walt's had on his podcast in terms of the international sort of career presence they've had, and you're probably one of the most impressive. I'd probably got to say, if I can toot you on a little bit, just in the sense that I know you had the benefit of being half Korean. Like, if I can point that out, well, most of Substack, if anyone knows that you say it yourself, you're half Korean. One of your parents, I forgot what it was, but you're saying that I'll say it. I'll pull the mixed race card. I'm half Jewish. I'm half an eighth Estonian, and then the rest of me is Scottish settler to some extent. Mum thought we had a bit of Aboriginal in us, but I did the DNA test. There was no Aboriginal, and my mum was like, "No, but there could be." No, Mum, the DNA test says no Aboriginal. I'm sorry, but it was kind of funny. But what I'm trying to say here is, when you get to go to Korea, because maybe, I'm not sure if you have a dual citizenship sort of situation going on, but that probably would have made it easier. But it's cool that Walt's had on these podcast sort of people who've got this career, being able to do that kind of work. What is it that you do for a living? If I can ask what you do without too much detail, it might be
vagabond. I'll say. So, I thank you for your words, though. But I think my status is I don't have dual citizenship. I have an overseas Korean visa, which is like one you can get if you are either a former citizen or one of your parents or grandparents was. Which makes it's basically like a green card. But it's pretty easy to move to a lot of countries in Asia if you're from an Anglophone country. It's just you can't. Most of them, though, it's just hard to get citizenship, but there are exceptions. So I know if you go to Taiwan, you only have to live there like 5 years and you can become a citizen. I think you just have to like pass a Mandarin test and like a citizenship test, so it's like quite easy. Korea is pretty difficult. They have foreign workers here. In Japan, they changed their naturalization laws the last few years, so now it's become more straightforward to become a citizen. But it's kind of engendered some backlash in the past few months politically. So see how long it lasts. But as I said earlier, it's like when you go there, there are a lot of immigrants nowadays, and they kind of dominate. A lot of these like low-level service sector jobs.
Italy was doing the same thing, and there was this referendum that was voted down this year where they were going to make it easier to reduce the citizenship pipeline from like 10 years to 5 years and make it easier for people to become citizens overnight. Well, not overnight, it's 5 years, still a lot of time, but they've got some very robust laws that prevent you from being able to stay there forever and vote in the elections. Because they're very protective of what constitutes being Italian to still at least some extent. There's a massive migrant population in Italy right now, and everyone from iDubbbz and all sorts of stuff are talking about it. And my housemate's mostly Italian, himself Italian Australian, and he no doubt always talks about it when we're at the lounge room. So it's an interesting one, really. I was looking at this election, I forgot but they got voted down, but it was like this referendum just to try and make things easier streamline for migrants. But the only benefit I see from that personally is like boosting the voter rolls and having like like from the perspective of a politician, you've got more voters and you can then manipulate them using incentives to vote for you. So I don't like, I understand that, but I guess it's interesting too. What you talk about green cards. So let's try to wrap this up because originally I thought 2 hours, done 3 hours. I can't believe that Riverside FM is letting me do this. It's actually pretty awesome. I'm not going to lie. I thought it originally said 2 hours, but it didn't kick us off, so I was still talking. But what I was going to say here was the two thing about when you talk about green card, it's such an interesting one because in Australia we have it doesn't have these weird card names. In Australia, it's like a visa, then permanent residency, which is basically like the ability to stay in the country permanently but not vote. And then after being a permanent resident for however many years, you end up being able to apply for a citizenship test, which is really not that hard. It's just the basic values and whatever else. And God knows we fucking hand out so much citizenship to people who stick to their guns here. And I'd arguably also try to say game system in some ways, know all the loopholes and stuff. And handing out so many damn citizenships, eventually at the end of the day, once they've made it through, we've got a very robust system. We've got a strict system, but if you know how to game it or blast it out, you get the citizenship and you're able to vote. And then you're at the mercy of the party propagandas and whatever the parties tell you to vote for them and stuff like that. And then you're also forced to vote in Australia. It's a legal obligation or you get fined $50. So it's a very interesting system. But yeah, I guess what you're saying is, you talk green card, it's not like a permanent residency, you just can't vote, right?
Indeed. I actually I have a friend who has Australian citizenship. I don't think has ever actually lived there because I think if you have enough money, you can buy the permanent residency in Australia, basically, right? And then I think if you hold it long enough, you can get citizenship, then your kids get it. So I think that's what happened.
Is that true?
I think there's an investment visa that it's a significant amount of money. So I think your friend
the Crazy Rich Asians real IRL, I think.
Well, there you go.
Well, I'm gonna lie then. Like, if that's the case, like, look, there's a lot of fucking. It's like just in England they got fucking Russian oligarch money everywhere. In Australia we got like Asian oligarch money. We got so much bloody money laundering from Asian oligarchs in the country.
Casinos.
And we have casinos, apartment blocks, hotels. Big ones for the Chinese investors, the Chinese oligarchs was you could say casinos, but I think the big one was actually residential apartment blocks and stuff like that, from what I understand. Like there was all these. I was talking in Ubers all the damn time with people who would do construction work and stuff like that, and they just tell me, oh yeah, I used to, before I drove Ubers, I was working construction, and building a Chinese site, and we'd avoid the level 4 because the level 4 has the negative connotation, so that there'd be these Chinese built buildings that went like 1, 2, 3, 5.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's where I thought that all the money went, and all it's the international student program. I could yabber on for even more hours, but I got some dishes to wash up, and I didn't know we could go over this over time. Definitely, we'll have another episode of this. Have our friend Sasquatch on. Hopefully, he has a good run too. He should love a good run. He's always funny to have on. And when he is on, he's always a bag of beans. But that's it for me. I'll leave it to you last guys to make any final comments.
Yeah, thank you for having me on, and it was nice meeting Sunshine and all. We always have interesting conversations, and obviously I'd like to meet you guys again. Looking forward to who I know Sassy in real life as well. So looking forward to seeing Sasquatch in the next episode probably. I'll leave the last note to Sunshine.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I really enjoyed it, and I look forward to listening to your next interview as well. So I will stay tuned.
Thank you. And so that's been the Contemplation deck, everyone. Even if you hold your opinion for 5 seconds, your opinion's your own, and not reflective of anything else other than your momentary lapse in thought. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I remember how you sang. I wish you'll just sing it. The West knows best. Oh, screw the rest. The West knows best. Love America.